The confrontation was inevitable. I burst through the door, catching them in their deceit. Her tears meant nothing. Her lover's fear was meaningless. The betrayal was too deep. Every lie, every kiss, every stolen moment replayed in my mind. I had to see justice done, no matter the cost. The darkness within me grew, and I was ready to unleash it all. In the last video, Tim felt anger as he saw his wife having fun with other men. He thought about doing something drastic, but he didn't. Instead, his actions left his wife and her new friends in a dangerous situation. He collected everything he needed to divorce her and moved out of the house with their kids. Tim's wife explained that she had these affairs because she wanted something new in her life. Meanwhile, Tim hired a lawyer to start the divorce process while she hoped to save their marriage. Now, it was Sunday, 3 days after the winter storm. At 11 a.m., Tim gathered his young sons around their children's Bible. Laura and Will joined them, and they spent some time reading from the Bible and praying. The boys said simple prayers, asking God to keep their mommy safe and thanking Him. They all ended their worship with the Lord's Prayer. After the short service, Tim put away the Bible and told the boys they were going to a park to play and then eat. Though he still felt angry about his wife, he focused on making sure she was okay for the sake of their children. Tim tried to call Andy, but the phone line was busy, showing the storm still affected communication. He bundled the kids up and took them to the park. Laura stayed close, worried about the boys running too close to the river. Meanwhile, the men shared stories about growing up in South Texas. When the boys came running back, saying they were hungry, Tim promised to take everyone to lunch at a place with a kids' menu. They decided to go to their favorite spot, Krause's Beer Garden and Cafe. On the way back to Will and Laura's house, they stopped by Carl's store to pick up the developed film and videos. Tim paid Carl, but Carl looked serious. He warned Tim not to watch the videos because he already had what he needed to get custody of the kids. He added that seeing the videos would only make Tim feel worse. Tim thanked him but knew he would watch all of them anyway. He felt the need to gather all the information he could for his plans. As they drove, they avoided talking about the videos in the truck. When they got home, the phone rang. Laura answered and passed the phone to Tim, saying it was Andy. Tim spoke to his friend, telling him the boys would be happy to hear their mommy was okay. He turned to the boys. "Listen, they found mommy and she's fine. She got really cold and caught the flu though, so we'll stay away for a few days to keep from getting sick." The boys cheered, and Laura took them to the living room to play with their toys. Tim watched Will's face as he absorbed the news, trying to understand how he felt. Then Tim asked Andy what the sheriff thought had happened. After a few quiet moments, Andy explained the confusion among the fire department, insurance, and police. Tim's friend seemed pleased with the information. "Did anyone say anything about the truck?" Tim asked, and waited in silence. His expression changed as he listened, showing signs of anger. When Andy continued to speak, Tim's frustration boiled over. "So that's her story? Does she think I'm a fool? She's been playing me for months and she couldn't come up with a better excuse? She has no respect for me." Laura shook her head at Will and whispered, "Remember that night you drank too much tequila and told me stories about Tim? Was any of that true?" Will nodded but closed his eyes, looking as if he was praying. Tim's voice was tense as he spoke to Andy again. "I'll stay calm by tomorrow when we meet. But if I run into her friends at school, I'm not making any promises. I'll take deep breaths or try yoga first. In the morning, I'll sort out the banking stuff like you said, and I will stop by before work to let you help me calm down if I'm still angry." Andy talked longer, and Tim finally agreed that they should take their time to catch everyone involved. He told Andy to hire whoever was needed, and then they said goodbye. Tim held his hands up in a gesture of uncertainty, wondering what would happen next. Tim made sure his boys were busy before he shared with Will what the police had told Andy. After finishing the story, Tim asked if he understood correctly. "So they think it was a natural disaster? Since everything burned, there's no proof it wasn't," Tim said. Tim nodded with a grin, and both men burst into laughter. They kept laughing until one of them caught their breath. "At least you didn't shoot at them when they ran out to escape the fire." They laughed even harder at that. Laura watched them closely until they calmed down. Should I ask if maybe the weather wasn't the only reason for what happened Friday night? She wondered. No, you shouldn't, her husband responded before he and Tim started laughing again. Laura thought she could get the truth from him if she tried, so she decided to let it go for now. Instead, she asked him what Andy had said next. He repeated what Andy shared about Karen when he checked on her, telling his story of what happened. Laura raised an eyebrow. That sounds possible. Do you think it's not true? She asked. Tim assured her he had reasons to think so and that it would come back to hurt her if she kept lying. Laura, I plan to make my unfaithful wife my ex-wife soon, but I also want to make sure to punish the others involved. Just be patient, and I will keep you updated. He paused, smiling while looking at her. But we need to leave soon. I've got a hotel room near my bank and lawyer. I have a lot to do tomorrow morning. His friends felt let down but helped him pack everything into the car and strapped his sons into their seats. He hugged Will goodbye and then gave Laura a big hug and a kiss. Take it easy on Will, okay? He's here if you ever need someone to talk to, he said, reminding her she could reach out if things felt overwhelming. She laughed and playfully hit his arm before moving to hug her husband. He's better than he looks. We'll be fine. But I know he has your number if needed, she said. Tim chuckled and promised he would try his best and hope it was enough. As Tim pulled away, he felt grateful for his good friends and was ready to forgive whatever mistakes Will and Karen had made before. On Sunday, after seeing Karen, Andy felt guilty as he drove home, replaying what had almost happened. He knew she was trying to win him over and he understood why. But she was so beautiful. He almost gave in. He kept thinking about her stunning looks and how great her relationship with Tim had been. He started to doubt the plans they had made in anger, pushing his worries aside. He already had the information Tim wanted from the police. Since the power was back on, he called Tim as soon as he got home, even though he felt nervous. After explaining what the police found at the scene, burned buildings, wires, and people almost frozen, he told Tim the police believed it was a storm-related incident. The sheriff's department and the fire department came to that conclusion based on what they saw. The old wires that were still hanging were only metal frames because they burned so badly. Andy described the charred remains of a shed and what was left of a house, which was just ashes, burned wood, and some metal parts of appliances. The evidence seemed to match the owner's story, so the authorities moved on to other matters to handle after the storm. The evidence was so clear that even the insurance investigator agreed with their findings. Tim shrugged and said it was just karma. Andy said while the fire may have been an accident, the way they concluded it was both good and bad. It was good because now he could stop worrying about being arrested for trespassing and fire-related charges, but bad because it made it harder to use the photos and videos as proof. How could he explain having them? Tim reacted as Andy expected, focusing on their plans for revenge instead of worrying about the lost evidence. Andy warned Tim not to let his anger and need for revenge cloud his thinking. He asked if Tim was sure he wanted to go through with the divorce plans. Remember, she was a wonderful partner, and they had a strong family. Maybe with some help, she could get past her troubles and you both could find happiness again. Andy shared his own experience. I never really got over my divorce, and I don't want you to feel the pain I do every day. If I had stayed calm and listened to mine, I might have saved my marriage. But I lost everything because I sought revenge instead of understanding. Tim firmly said that was not an option for him. He asked Andy to finalize the divorce papers so he could sign and file them the next day. Andy sighed and told him that if he chose this path, he needed to hire a private investigator to help gather more evidence. Tim knew he needed strong proof of his ex-wife's bad behavior if he wanted to get full custody of the boys. He explained to Andy that they had to gather this information before he could file any papers. If they didn't, it would cause a huge mess, even bigger than the winter storm that had just hit. Andy said he knew someone who could help, and he might be able to get a lower rate since this person wasn't cheap. Tim agreed quickly and asked Andy to call this private investigator after their meeting the next morning. Andy suggested he go home and talk to his wife first, but Tim said he wasn't ready for that. As Tim worked on the new documents, he couldn't stop thinking about Karen. He imagined being close to her, but soon guilt washed over him like a wave. He made up his mind about what to do next and called the best family lawyer he could find, Patricia Houseman. On Monday morning at 8:15, Tim took his sons to the daycare near their motel. After dropping them off, he went to the bank. He split their savings into his account and her account and canceled the joint credit card. They had 2 certificates of deposit worth $5,000 each. He took Karen off one and himself off the other. Then he headed to Andy's place to go over all the paperwork and assure Andy he was focused today. To his surprise, a woman around 40 to 45 years old was sitting with Andy. "Tim, let me introduce you to Patricia Houseman," Andy said. "She's my good friend and the best family lawyer around. She will represent you in your divorce." Tim felt confused. Patricia explained, "Andy called me last night and told me about your situation. I'm here to help." She said that if Tim agreed, Andy would deal with matters related to her boyfriend, while Patricia would handle everything about his wife. "You'll get better help this way, and Andy won't have to choose between you two." Tim nodded and looked at Andy, who seemed a bit uneasy. "I hope you still have client confidentiality with Andy, right?" he asked. Patricia smiled and said, "Please call me Patty. And yes, it applies to Andy too. Andy, would you give us a moment alone?" After Andy left, Tim took 20 minutes to explain his story and answered Patricia's questions. Soon, Andy knocked and said the private investigator would arrive at Tim's house in 10 minutes. Patty said she would be with him for the meeting with his wife, but it would happen at Andy's office. Tim thanked her for joining him and turned to Andy, who looked tense. "You seemed taken with her yesterday. Do I need to add your name to the list of people to represent me?" Tim asked. Andy looked shocked, but then blushed. He finally met Tim's gaze and answered, "No, but she is quite tempting." They needed to focus on the task at hand, so Andy told Tim to meet the private investigator at home. "He should be there in 5 minutes," Andy said. "Let them work while you go on with your day. We need things to seem as normal as possible." Tim had about 20 minutes before he had to be at school. On Sunday, he'd told the assistant principal, Chet, that he would arrive after 11:30. Chet told him school would start at 10, so he would cover Tim's class that morning. Tim promised to be there for athletics and asked if Chet could meet him in the coach's office at 11:40. Chet agreed, asking if Tim needed to bring anything for protection. Tim joked that he might need both tools to deal with some troublemakers. He needed the time to show the investigator and his technician around his house, teach them how to set up their equipment, and how to check and change the recordings. After checking in at the school office, Tim and Chet made their way to the coach's offices. Tim noticed some colleagues in Steve's office and let Chet chat with them. He went to the locker room, greeted the other coaches, and got ready for practice. Chet and Frank left when the other coaches arrived. They set the players up. Some went to the weight room, while others went outside for drills. Tim coached as he normally would, running the drills with the players and then practicing their offense. After their workout, the players changed back into their school clothes, rushing off to lunch. As Tim walked out chatting with his friend Gary about the storm, Coach Slaughter called out to him, "Coach Kelly, can I talk to you for a minute? Come into my office." Tim whispered to Gary, "Do me a favor and ask Chet to come back quickly." Gary rushed out of the room and Tim turned back. Slaughter held the door open. Inside were Robertson and Hughes waiting for him. Slaughter pointed to a chair, but Tim chose to sit on the couch against the wall. He took the newspapers from his seat, folded them carefully, and placed a recorder he had hidden in his hand inside the folds. "Coach, we heard you weren't home to greet your wife when we finally got her back," he said. "We just want to clear up any confusion," Slaughter spoke earnestly. "This trip was a last-minute idea. I wanted to be at the game to help out. JW offered to drive, and we thought it would be nice to invite your wife in case it was the last game of the season." She agreed, and we all helped pay for a babysitter. We should have checked the weather, but we were in a rush to see the earlier games. Karen could enjoy some time with you, he added. Tim's face was plain, and he stared intensely at Slaughter, making him uneasy. Rogers jumped in. "We almost got there when we heard the games were canceled, so we turned around. On the way back, we stopped at your house to check on the poker players. They were still playing, even after we said we were going to the game. We thought we had time before the storm hit, so we stayed in the house, drinking and watching the game. Then everything went crazy. The power went out, and our trucks caught fire because a wire spark flew everywhere. The fire spread from the trucks to your house," Rogers explained. We ran to the boathouse and had a terrible night there. It was freezing. Karen wore a light dress, so we gave her extra blankets, but she still got sick and had to go to the hospital because you weren't there," Rogers said accusingly. Hughes spoke up. "Tim, I respect your wife. She's my best teacher. You have to believe us. Nothing wrong happened between us." Tim stayed calm as he looked from one man to the other. He saw the untruths in their eyes. Chet knocked and walked in. "What's going on, guys?" Tim replied. "They were just assuring me they did nothing wrong with my wife when they spent the night together." Chet nodded. "It was all innocent." Tim said with a tilted head, "When I got home and found a babysitter instead of my wife, I got a bit upset. I drove around for a while until the storm hit. When my wife didn't come home that night, I got more worried. I was angry and took my kids to stay with family who had power. When I learned Sunday afternoon that my wife was with you three, plus some others, I couldn't help but think about what could have happened." Tim continued, "I wondered if a group of coaches and school board members would really do something like that. Are they really that careless? These are supposed to be professionals, not troublemakers. Would they act that foolishly?" He thought about their characters, jobs, and family histories. "After thinking it through, I still didn't feel better. I asked myself if they would be reckless enough to cross that line with my wife." He looked at them closely, sensing their discomfort. Tim then stood up, saying, "This afternoon I will meet with my wife and her attorney along with my lawyers. I will hear what she has to say and make some decisions. But let this be clear. If you are lying, the trouble from this storm will be nothing compared to what will come next." With those words, he turned to Chet and said, "Let's go," and they walked out. Once outside, Chad asked, "What's the name of the storm that's about to hit Central Texas?" Tim answered, "It's called Abaddon, the angel of death and destruction." Chet was quiet as they walked back to campus. He gently touched Tim's arm and warned, "Remember, this is not South Texas with its little creeks and ponds." Tim replied, "True, but there's a big, deep lake." Chet chuckled. "What were they thinking? Especially Karen. Wow, that is probably the least attractive group I've ever seen." "Except for that guy married to Jeannie," Tim added. "By the way, she called in sick today. Said she would be out for days, maybe all week." Chet said something that made him turn to his friend and ask a question. "Did she say why?" Tim wanted to know. "Yeah," Chet replied, keeping his eyes forward. "She said she fell at home and hurt herself." They walked quietly for a while as they got closer to the school. Then Tim asked, "You think what I'm thinking? She must have confronted him and he really hurt her." "Do you still have your boat at your place?" Tim joked that he might be the first person to swim in the deep part of Lake Travis with a heavy block tied to him. Chet laughed and gave Tim a friendly pat on the back. "You should find out more before jumping to conclusions. But really, when you're ready, I want to hear the full story about this adventure of the storm survivor." Tim promised to share it later and headed to teach his afternoon class, AP Biology. After the class ended, he went to the gym parking lot to meet Sharon. She had the statements he needed, except for one. "Mary Perry didn't want to get involved," she said. "But we all know the real reason. She has a big crush on Coach Rogers since he got divorced." She went on to say they included that night in the reports, since they knew when Mary was present. Everyone else wrote down when they babysat his kids, who hired them, who took them there, and who picked them up. They noted names of anyone seen in the car with his wife, just like you asked. Sharon looked at him with excitement as she spoke, and he smiled back at her gratefully. She gave him a playful smile and promised, "Anything for you, Coach." Then she tossed her long blonde hair, turned back to make sure he was watching, and walked to her car. She wore a tight dress that stopped mid-thigh, and he couldn't help but watch her. She was beautiful and smart, and all he had to do was ask her out. He shook his head, calling himself foolish, and walked to his truck. He noticed Slaughter's car was at the admin office, so he grabbed his recorder from a folded newspaper in the field house. His wife called to say she could leave work early, so he got ready for their meeting at 3 o'clock. Before the meeting, Tim spoke with Patty again, saying he wanted Karen on record. If she wouldn't go on record, he planned to leave. She gave him her lawyer's name, and he asked her to have him verify her story officially. He agreed to go back home only if Karen would do 3 things. 1, put her whereabouts on record for Friday night. 2, say she had never been with those men before. And 3, say that what she told him was the truth. He also wanted her to agree to an STD test and counseling. They walked into the large meeting room where Karen, Barry, Benson, and Andy were waiting. Karen looked good in a nice navy blue jumpsuit that showed off her figure. She sat next to Benton, who didn't seem happy to see Patty. Andy sat at the head of the table and had been talking with Karen, but stopped to smile widely when Tim and Patty arrived. Tim nodded to everyone and sat down across from Karen, though he avoided her gaze. Andy introduced everyone, even though everyone except Patty and Karen knew each other. Andy explained that the meeting was to clarify what had happened last Friday when Mrs. Kelly didn't come home to her children and husband. Benson jumped in, saying his client wanted to share her side and show how much he cared by taking her children away instead of waiting for her to return. He claimed that she faced more emotional pain after being helped. Patty then said, "So you won't mind if we record this conversation?" She mentioned that Tim had heard different stories from the police and others and wanted a clear account from his wife. He needed to have this meeting on the record, and he assumed there were no objections. Benton looked annoyed and began to talk, but Karen interrupted him. "Of course we don't mind. The truth doesn't need to hide." Andy looked a bit uneasy while Benton seemed upset. Patty thanked her and started the tape recorder, listing everyone present and the agreement to keep everything on the record. She leaned back, asked each person to introduce themselves, and told Karen to go ahead. But Tim interrupted. "This is Tim Kelly. Karen," he continued, "as I wrote in my note, I need you to tell me the truth, all of it. You'll only have this chance, is that clear?" "Oh yes, honey, that is very clear," she replied. "And don't worry, I really want to explain what happened so you'll see why you reacted the way you did." Patty noted, the previous speaker was Karen Kelly. Andy felt a burning pain in his chest as he looked at Tim, silently urging him to speak up. Tim did. "Karen, you don't know what I know. But before you start talking, know that I understand more than you think I do. If you tell me something that isn't true, I will ask for a divorce and temporary custody of our sons. You only get one chance. This is it." Karen hesitated and glanced at Benton. He nodded, and that seemed to calm her fears. "Tim," Patty interrupted, "this is Karen Kelly speaking." "Mrs. Kelly, you may begin." Karen started again. "Tim, honey, nothing happened on Friday. It was just bad luck. Steve invited me to your game, and I called Sharon to babysit. While she told the same lies she told Andy, she also told Tim in the coach's office." Tim kept his eyes on her, searching for any hint of honesty. Sadly, he found nothing when she spoke about being saved. He looked at Andy, who was now slumped in his chair. Karen finished. "So you see, Tim, it was all a big misunderstanding. Nothing happened between me and any of the men that wouldn't pass the husband test. Please come home and bring my boys back. I want our happy lives back. I forgive you for doubting me." Andy sighed softly and lowered his head. Tim looked at Karen and said, "Okay, let's review. I asked who? You said Roger, Vince, Ward, Allen, and Barnes. I asked what happened. You said nothing that you wouldn't want your husband to see. I asked how long. You said just this one time on Friday night. I asked why. Your answer was bad luck. What do you say, Mr. Benton? What's your version?" Benton met Tim's gaze and claimed that everything Karen said about the time they had at the ranch was the truth. But he admitted he couldn't say what happened before that since he wasn't in the truck with them when he stopped talking. Karen, sounding condescending, said, "Okay, now you know I'm upset. You jumped to conclusions and took my sons away. I promise I'll forgive you when you bring them home. Just give me a hug, a kiss, and apologize tonight." Tim looked at Benton, then at Andy, and finally at Karen with a serious look. "Karen, we won't be coming home tonight or any night. I warned you how I would react if you lied, and you've lied way too often. Any trust or love I had for you is gone. Don't act surprised. I told you I knew more than you think." He turned from his shocked wife to her surprised lawyer and said, "Why would I ever take you back after you betrayed me and lied about it? Do you see something in me that nobody else does? I won't be your fool. I won't ignore what you've done. Mr. Benton, you should warn your other clients. They will be hearing from my lawyer soon, too. Goodbye." Tim stood up and walked to the small office where he and his attorney had met before. Patty gathered her files and notes. Karen sat there, stunned by Tim's reaction, while Benton quietly packed his papers. Karen looked at Andy and saw a look of disgust she had never seen before. This made her break down and cry. Andy got up and asked them to leave through the front door. He wished them a good day and went down the hall to meet Tim and Patty. When he entered the small office, Tim was sitting against the wall. Patty had the phone in her hand as she asked Tim about the custody and divorce papers. Tim nodded and looked at Andy. "What about the others?" Andy asked. Tim replied, "You know what to do. Getting full custody of the boys is our top goal. Getting rid of the troublemakers is the short-term goal. Long-term, we want to make sure they feel the weight of their actions. So you let me know when you're ready." Andy had some news. "My friend, who is the president of the school board, heard about what happened on Friday. He had the board secretary add 2 items to the meeting agenda on Thursday. They seem minor now, but if we are prepared, he plans to suspend all the school staff involved and censor 2 board members. The board's lawyer is even looking into ways to kick them out if they don't resign. With this in mind, I suggest we wait until Friday to act." Tim divided some statements from the babysitter among both attorneys. He mentioned that one girl wouldn't give a statement, but added, "This shows it has been happening weekly since after Christmas. I want to get back at them, but ruining them will be enough if they deserve it. None of these men should be around children." He added, "I learned today that Larry's wife took the week off because she fell at home, but we know what really happened. I'll talk to her before I pick up the boys. If he hurt her, she should call my husband. He will make sure she is safe and that he pays for a long time. Here's his card." Tim stood up when his friend Tim did and took his arm. "You were right," he said sincerely. "She lies all the time. I can't tell you to go back to her, but Tim, don't let your anger hurt your son. If you're in jail, she'll get to keep him no matter what she's done. Stay calm." Tim thought for a bit, shook hands with his lawyers, promised to stay calm, and then left. When he rang Jeannie's doorbell, she didn't answer. She said she was sick and didn't want him to catch anything. He reminded her she told the school she was hurt and that he would call the police if she didn't let him in. Finally, she opened the door just a little and begged him to leave, but he gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jeannie hid behind the door, trying to keep her face hidden. Tim felt rage when he saw her pretty face was swollen and bruised. One eye was almost closed shut. He noticed more bruises on her arms and that she was holding her side. "I swear I'll make him pay," Tim thought, angry. Jeannie shut the door and pleaded, "Please, Tim. He just lost his temper. He promised he wouldn't do it again." "Is this the first time he promised that?" Tim asked, doubting her words. Jeannie looked down and he knew the answer. "Jeannie, people don't change, especially bullies. He will keep hurting you. You need to let someone help you. I know the right person. You need to call Jimmy Houseman. I'll help you make the call. You need to tell him everything. I'll stay with you until your lawyer can help." Jeannie shook her head, looking scared and ashamed. "No, please." Tim insisted. "Do you want to get hurt more? You have to stop this now. I'm calling them. You will talk." Jeannie still looked scared, but took the phone from him. She listened for a while, said yes, and then cried as she told the lawyer her story. Tim's heart ached for her as she talked about how scared she was when he left. She told him about her husband coming home and beating her until she lost consciousness. Tim's sympathy turned to anger at the man who hurt her. He promised himself that the man would feel the pain Jeannie endured. After her call, Tim helped her pack a bag and gently helped her into his truck. He drove her to Jimmy's house where she would stay until she was safe. On the way there, Jeannie hesitated. "Larry got mad because I didn't believe his story about poker, and he was upset about his car being burned. I told him I've never known him to play, and he got angry. I was furious he was lying, so I said I've known him to cheat on me. That's when he hit me," she continued. "I begged him to stop, but he just kept hitting me. Then he grabbed a broom and hit me with that, too. When it broke, he told me I wasn't really hurt and that he would take care of me." "Jeannie, does he really think you can believe him?" Tim asked. "You can't trust him at all. He lied about everything." She looked down, lost in thought. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should have believed him. "No, he's a liar. You have to get away from him. You deserve to be safe." Tim looked at her. "We both have been hurt. I'll support you and you can support me. We need each other right now." Jeannie nodded, then leaned her head on his shoulder. "I didn't know Karen was there too. I'm so sorry, Tim. This must be hard for you. I need your support and I want to help you too. Can we do that? Tim tried to lighten the mood. Sure, I can think of a way to help each other, but it might take a while. Jeannie looked up at him a bit playfully and said, With how I feel right now, I don't think I can help you like that. Maybe we should wait until things are better for both of us, Tim said, tilting his head to see her better. Even with the bruises, you're still beautiful, he said softly. I miss seeing both your lovely blue eyes. She laughed and playfully hit his chest again, but it felt more like a friendly tap than anger at what he said. Tim kept talking, saying the most important thing he got from her was about their first time together. He told her he would wait as long as she promised there would be a first time in their future. I'll wait happily, she said quietly, looking down. When Tim asked her to repeat it because she wasn't looking at him, she lifted her head from his shoulder, leaned against his arm, and said, I will wait if you promise it will happen as soon as I'm better. This surprised him because, despite their many chats and his light flirting, she had never shown any interest in moving their friendship further. She seemed too nice to flirt back or cheat on her husband. Yet, her answer showed she had been thinking about it for a while. That's the easiest promise I've ever made. Get well soon, Jeannie, he said sweetly. They were at the horseman's house. Tim parked his truck, helped Jeannie with her bags to the door, and met Patty's husband. The men were told to wait in one place while Patty took Jeannie to her room. Jimmy shook his head, grabbed Tim's hand, and said, I'm really sorry. Since our cases are connected, Patty told me what happened so I could be ready. She insisted I take Jeannie's case and that your friend stay here to keep her safe. He laughed, releasing Tim's hand. With a knowing smile, he added, You've got a challenge here. From what I've seen, you might want to keep me on your side. I'm a criminal lawyer. Tim handed him a $100 bill and asked, Where do I sign? Jimmy chuckled again and led him to their nice home office. He brought out a contract, filled in the main parts, and handed it to Tim to sign. After signing, Jimmy said, Now you have a 2-man, 1-woman legal team in place. Why do I feel you're going to need us all before this is over? Tim looked at him fiercely and said, I never let anyone disrespect me. I won't allow my friends to be hurt without making sure the ones who did it pay. My friends would tell you I'm a good friend but a terrible enemy. I see my wife and those involved as my enemies. And Larry Barnes is at the top of my list. You know I was there and I took pictures and got proof. But you don't know that I had a gun, or that I seriously thought about just taking care of them myself. Andy doesn't want me to use the pictures or recordings because they would show I was there, and the sheriff might want to investigate the fire again. But I'm warning you, Jimmy, I will use what I have to fight for custody of my sons, even if it risks everything. I refuse to let A304 raise my kids, and I won't let those terrible people get away with it. So be ready if it comes to that. And if Jeannie's husband tries to hurt her again, I'll need you even sooner. Patty and Jeannie were standing just outside the door, listening. Jimmy saw them, called them in, and told them Tim was now his client as well. How much did you hear? He asked. Patty replied, We got here when Tim started talking about never letting anyone disrespect him, so we heard quite a bit. She then turned to Tim and said, I think we need to ask Andy to come over and bring the proof you have. I know you have a private investigator working on this and you have cameras set up in several places, but we can wait on those. Jimmy, call Andy. I'll order pizza if everyone tells me what they want. We can start working on this tonight. Tim said he would love to start, but needed to pick up his sons. Patty insisted the boys stay at their home and offered 2 more bedrooms. Tim agreed, canceled their hotel room, and went to get his boys. When he returned with his excited little boys and all their things, Patty, Jimmy, and Jeannie made a big fuss over them. They made sure the boys had their favorite pizza and filled their milk glasses while listening to all their stories about new friends from daycare. When the boys asked about Jeannie's injuries, she explained she had fallen down and hoped she didn't look too scary. The boys immediately hugged her, and baby Mark told her he would help with her boo-boos because he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. He took a doctor kit to her while Patrick entertained Jimmy and Patty. As the pizza and excitement wore off, Tim bathed the boys and got them ready for bed. After saying their prayers, he told them a story about brave knights, fierce dragons, and fair maidens, and soon they were asleep. When he returned to the office, the others were discussing their options. Tim pulled out a tape recorder and another cassette tape from his briefcase. Andy had arrived with the audio and videotapes Tim had taken from the ranch before the fire. He greeted him, and the ladies asked if the boys were asleep. Jimmy suggested they move to the den, where he had a big TV and a video player. He put in the tape labeled KK, but Tim wanted to start with the recording from the coach's office today. He was eager to see how they reacted to his words and leaving. The first 10 minutes showed his conversation with them, but things got really intriguing from there. After Frank and Chet left JW, he started complaining loudly. "How does he know all this? How could he?" Frank jumped in. "I'm not so sure. He said he would listen to her." "As long as we all stick to the same story, we'll be fine," Steve told JW. "Call your brother. Tell him what happened and see what he knows about Tim. We might be dealing with someone more dangerous than we thought, especially if he started the fire." JW checked his watch and called his brother's office at a small but rich school in South Texas. "Tommy, I'm glad you're in your office instead of out with some cheerleader or their mom. Hey, we have you on speaker. Is that okay? Steve and Frank are with me." "Hello, boys. Are you getting my little brother in trouble?" Tommy joked. "Actually, that's why we're calling. Don't you have a coach who knows Tim Kelly?" Steve asked. "Yes, he's here with me," Tommy said. "JW, Frank, this is Carlos. We're on speaker now. There are only 2 of us in the office." "Carlos, nice to hear you," JW shouted. "Wow, Jay, you're still alive? I thought someone would have taken care of you by now," Carlos joked. "You know, like the guy here tried to do." "That was a mix-up," Steve replied. "Simon told me they were separated." Carlos continued, "Let me tell you a story, and then I'll ask you something. Okay?" When Carlos agreed, Steve shared the story, stressing the 2 explosions, the live electrical wire, and the fire. "Tell me, Carlos, does that sound like your man Kelly? You said the back of the house was on fire, right? Well, that sounds like how he became known, but it wasn't him." "How do you know?" Steve asked. Carlos replied, "Because you're still alive. When Tim Kelly sets a building on fire, he waits at the front to shoot whoever comes out the door or windows. That's what my cousins back home said happened. The law thought a bad oil spill started the fire, and the people living there left for Mexico. No one looked too hard for them because they were involved in drugs. They had hurt a friend's sister and other girls too, so they just let it go. They never found any bodies. So who knows? As we say around here, Kayan Saab." "Carlos, you aren't making me feel any better," Steve said. "When did all this happen?" "Back when he was a sophomore or junior in college. He came home after a game and found out what happened to the girls. After that, a lot of bad things happened to bad people. The police seemed happy. They'd find outlaws badly hurt and then they would just vanish. Or they vanished at the same time girls stopped disappearing. Drug sales dropped, and shop owners didn't need to pay for protection anymore. The police acted like nothing was wrong. When they were asked, they said nothing was happening besides what the law was doing. But we knew it was those gangs from La Rosada, or those called Raton del Siglo. Some are white, some are Mexican, but all are dangerous. If it really was him, or if he finds out you were with his ex-girlfriend, I hear Panama is nice this time of year. You might want to book a trip." After they hung up, everyone in the coach's office was worried. They promised to meet with the others after Karen, Tim, and the lawyers had spoken to plan their next steps. The tape went quiet for a moment after a door opened and closed until Tim picked it up later. Tim had been watching the tape. When he looked up, everyone else was looking at him closely. "Tim, is that story true?" Jimmy asked. "If you call the sheriff, he will tell you a very different story," Tim said. "Carlos is just adding to the story down there." Jeannie agreed, saying, "I find it hard to believe the nice man I have coffee with every day could do those things, even if they were drug dealers and attackers." "I find that way of thinking hard to believe enough," Andy replied. "From what I hear, that's how people in the Big Bend and parts of South Texas handle what the law can't or won't. 150 years ago, that's how they dealt with criminals, though most just got hanged." Neither Andy nor Jimmy said anything right away, but they watched Tim with a mix of respect and fear. Finally, Andy looked at Jeannie and said, "Jeannie, people say Audie Murphy was one of the nicest guys in the world, but he was also a decorated soldier. It's hard to know what a man can do until his life or his loved ones are at risk. I'm not saying Tim did anything like that, but being nice to someone like you is not the same as facing drug dealers who attack and hurt your friends." Jeannie looked thoughtful, and then turned to Tim, trying to shift the focus from him. "Do you want to hear more audio? We have 2 more tapes, or we can watch the video from Friday night." "The video?" Jeannie said quickly. "I want to see it for myself." Andy looked hesitant. "You two know watching the video will be hard, and those images might stay with you forever," he warned. "But if we do watch, and it's as bad as they say, leaving might not even be an option." "For me, there's no other way out," Tim said. Jeannie, "No, I want to see it," she said, though it was clear she was unsure even as she tried to sound certain. Jimmy then started the tape called KK. 3 of us hit play. We settled onto the couches and chairs and focused on the screen. The video started with a scene where Karen arrived at the door wearing a revealing dress. I answered the door, invited her in, and gave her a warm hug. Everyone in the room was paying close attention, but Jimmy and Andy were watching the hardest. JW and Karen began to kiss. Tim promised to stay calm, but watching them together really upset him. It was clear this wasn't their first time together. While everyone else was glued to the video, Tim's eyes drifted to Jeannie. Jeannie's face was bruised and swollen. Her eyes were red with tears. He could see her sadness for what he was going through. She knew her husband was about to be exposed for cheating, and despite everything, she felt sorry for him. He had realized over a year ago that she was a special person, but tonight showed just how caring and loving she truly was. Jimmy broke the silence. "Tim, I'm really sorry about what's happening. Can we skip ahead to when Larry Barnes shows up? Jeannie will be meeting with a police officer soon about the injuries from her husband. I think seeing what you described will help her feel stronger about filing charges." "Sure," Tim replied, moving the video forward. Jimmy mentioned that this was something Jeannie decided while her husband was with their kids, and Jeannie nodded in agreement. Tim leaned down and fast-forwarded until he saw Frank getting off the bed. He pushed play again and sat back down. Jeannie watched as her husband held Tim's wife, telling her how great their time together was. Tears fell freely from her eyes, but now there was a sense of determination in her. When Larry made fun of Tim, she set her jaw and told Jimmy, "I'm ready. I don't need to see more. He betrayed me and then hurt me when I questioned him about his poker game. I want him in jail while I collect my things from that house. He would be in trouble for sure if he keeps spending money we can't afford." "Patty, can we file for divorce as quickly as possible?" Jeannie continued. "And I want everything from him." "Absolutely," Jimmy added. "But first, tell the police officers in detail what happened and how badly he hurt you. Show them the bruises on your body. If a female officer comes, take her to another room and tell her everything. Don't hold anything back. There's no shame in being hurt by a monster. Make sure to mention the times he hit you before. We want him in jail and a protection order in place for you when he gets out." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Jimmy and Jeannie went to answer it. 2 police officers, 1 man and 1 woman, and a female emergency medical technician were there. They all went into the living room, and the door was closed so they could have some privacy. Patty, Andy, and Tim stayed behind to watch more of the video. Tim rewound it back to where they had fast-forwarded before. Karen was with JW when Steve came in from another room. He knelt behind her and grabbed her. The acting was decent, but the whole production was low quality. The video was more weird than anything, and Tim's loud laughter broke the tension, which got everyone else laughing too. After he calmed down, Tim joked, "I must be the worst husband for Karen to turn to these guys for anything. And seriously, why would anyone show their naked bodies in public, let alone on film? Is that really a thing in this industry?" Andy chuckled. "They should have invited me." Patty was laughing hard now, catching her breath between giggles. "You guys would have to prove it to me, but my Jimmy looks like a movie star next to those guys." Tim and Andy exchanged playful winks, stood up, and moved in front of Patty. "You said we have to prove it to you. Here we are," Andy teased. Patty laughed. "Really? With 2 cops and an EMT in here, you want me to check you out?" Tim replied. "Well, you're the one who said we have to prove it to you." Patty looked back and forth between the 2 men, glancing at the door nervously, before finally saying, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'll take your word for it." As they were laughing and the video played on, the door opened again. Jimmy's first words took the fun out of the moment. "The EMT is worried about Jeannie's eye socket. She wants to take her for x-rays. Patty, It might be best if you go with them to the hospital and bring her back if they let her go. Patty grabbed her purse and coat. How did she handle it? Jimmy replied. She was brave. She's definitely been abused, but she talked about the beating she took last Saturday and mentioned 3 other times he hit her too. She even told them about the mental and emotional abuse he put her through during their 2 years of marriage. I wanted to cry for her, but she stayed strong and laid it all out. She's tougher than she looks and tougher than she believes. Tim grabbed his jacket and said, I'm going with you. But the 3 lawyers explained why that plan was a bad idea. He nodded and told Patty to let Jeannie know he was on her side. Be brave, he said. She nodded back and left. Jimmy looked tired. He suggested they watch more videos tomorrow when they would feel better, and Andy agreed. Tim said, I want to watch some more now. I can't sleep anyway. Will I see you both back here tomorrow? They decided to meet for dinner, get the boys to sleep, and then have a meeting. Tuesday was pretty calm. Even gym class was drama-free. Tim did get some hard looks from JW and Steve, but maybe Chet hanging around kept them in check. Tim had changed into his gym clothes before coming to the school to avoid the office. He wanted to fight, but so far he kept his cool. Chet walked with Tim as they went to campus. I heard you doubted the story Karen told. I also heard you helped Jeannie from her bad situation and got her help. Tim agreed with the first part, but said the other roommates were the ones who really helped her. Interesting view, Tim. You do know Jimmy and I were fraternity brothers, right? And I introduced him to Patty? Let's just say their view is different from yours. What happened to lawyer-client privacy? Tim asked with a grin. Chet replied, sometimes friendship comes before that. Just before they got to the building, Chet stopped and told Tim something important. The school board president had changed the agenda for the upcoming meeting to include a secret session about claims against the Educator Code of Conduct. I have to tell Frank Hughes, Steve Slaughter, and John William Rogers that they must come to the meeting and can bring a lawyer if they want. The board president informed Joe Ward about an hour ago. I thought you'd want to know so you can avoid them until after the meeting. I think they're going to blame you instead of themselves, Chet said with a knowing look. And yes, you can thank the principal for my being at gym class today and for the rest of the week. He really has connections, Tim said. And he seems to like you a lot since you've been here for 6 weeks. Instead of stopping for lunch, Tim grabbed a sandwich while driving to his old home to swap the audio tapes. He rushed back to school to teach his afternoon classes and led a short meeting with the science team. Then he hurried to pick up his sons, as Patty suggested. The boys were at a local daycare in their safe neighborhood. The manager had strict rules that only Tim could pick them up. After he got them, they headed to Horseman's house, where they found 2 young girls about the same age as the boys, along with their mother. After they said hello, the mother, Casey, took all the kids to the kitchen for snacks, letting Tim and Patty talk in her office. Patty had just received the order for temporary custody after school, and she was upset. At first she cried, but then she gathered herself and marched into Frank's office, shouting at him for at least 5 minutes. The secretary, who was also close to Frank, kept everyone else away, but Tim could hear her from outside. He didn't catch everything, but the main point was that they had promised her that no one would know, and if she lost her children, she would make sure they paid. Frank responded, "If we stick to our story, you'll keep your kids." She seemed to calm down, or maybe she just got tired of yelling. "They're meeting tonight at your house to discuss their plan. I hope you have new tapes ready." Tim assured her that he did and wished he could watch. He knew his wife and the men were in for her anger, which he'd love to see, but he guessed he would just stick with the audio recordings. The hearing for the temporary custody was set for tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, in front of a judge who was well connected. Patty knew the situation, and she was confident that things would be fine. "I want to make sure you want us to call all 7 men to testify under oath," Tim confirmed. She warned him that this plan could backfire if the judge believed their stories after they spoke. "We'll make the decision soon. I'm sure we'll have what we need to make them pay by then. If not, I have more audio and videotapes in my bag. Trust me, Patty, she is not getting my sons. If she does, I'll let you know once the boys and I are settled somewhere far away." Patty laughed a little but shook her head and said, "Don't tell your lawyer about our talks." Jimmy and Andy joined them at that moment, and the three lawyers discussed their strategy until Pretty Mom returned with all four kids. She and Patty took casseroles out of the oven and called everyone to dinner at the big dining room table. The table was nearly full of vegetables, salads, casseroles, desserts, and drinks before they all sat down. One of the young girls ran to the back and came back with a man Tim didn't know, along with Aunt Jeannie, who looked terrible with her swollen face, stitches on her lip, and a big patch over her eye. Still, he could see that some of the swelling had gone down, and some of the bruises were changing color, which were good signs. The other three kids ran over to her. She knelt down, feeling the pain from kneeling and the pain from being hugged by the kids. Still, she smiled on the side of her face that wasn't as swollen from the hugs. Little Mark helped her to the table, wanting her to sit next to him. The others found their seats, leaving just one empty chair next to pretty Mommy Cassie. A moment later, that chair was taken by a stranger, handsome Dad Eric. He was welcomed with kisses from his wife and daughters. The talk was light, and the food was great. After they had French silk pie for dessert, everyone took their dirty dishes to the sink. Patty rinsed them, while Cassie loaded them into the dishwasher. The men went to the living room, and Jeannie took the kids into an extra bedroom-turned-playroom. The kids didn't seem to notice her injuries anymore, showing that kids can see beyond the surface and recognize kindness. Eric told Tim he had been the doctor on duty when Jeannie was brought to the hospital. It was just luck that he was there, but Jimmy had called the hospital to find out how she was. Eric learned what she needed for treatment and support. The talk turned serious as Eric explained that Jeannie had 2 broken ribs and a small crack in her eye socket. She had a mild concussion, too. Her kidneys were bruised, and there were signs of an old rib break from before. Eric had shared this with the police, and Jimmy told him that Larry Barnes was arrested at his home within an hour of leaving. Larry made bail a few hours later but had to stay 1,000 feet away from Jeannie and her home. He faced jail time until his trial. The officer who gave Jimmy this news said Larry was upset and might not follow the order. The officer said there would be a police car checking the house every day, but they couldn't promise her safety. Jeannie might need to hide somewhere safe for a while. Everyone in the room noticed how Tim's mood changed as they heard this. The anger that showed when he learned Larry might not obey the order was disturbing. Eric asked Tim how he was doing since Jeannie was worried about him after all he had been through. "I'm okay, as well as can be expected," Tim said. "She needs to focus on getting better and getting rid of that man for good." "Most men who hurt their wives don't change," Tim added. "Court orders and jail time don't stop them. Unless he's gone for good, I'm not sure Jeannie will ever be safe." Jimmy felt the need to remind Tim, "You have to give the system a chance. Right now we have no proof that he will come after her." "We're all aware," he continued. "We'll keep her here until things are settled. Hopefully, after we deal with him, he'll leave and Jeannie won't hear from him again." Tim replied, "I just worry he might hurt her before the system helps." Tim then focused on Jimmy, asking, "Do you have any guns here?" "Just a pistol in a safe under the bed," Jimmy said. Tim replied, "Do you mind if I bring some of mine in? A gun in a safe won't stop someone angry from coming in." Jimmy felt foolish for not thinking about the danger Jeannie faced. He quickly agreed to let Tim bring in his guns. Tim walked out to his truck. Dr. Eric watched him leave and said to Andy and Jimmy, "He's very tense. We need to keep him from going too far." "He's right," Eric said. "Men who hurt women often don't let the law stop them. We need to stay alert. Are your alarms working, Jimmy?" "They work, but I haven't been using them. I didn't think I'd need to in this area. I'll call and have them turned on again." Just then, Patty and Cassie came in from the kitchen as Tim returned with a pistol, a rifle, and a shotgun. Patty looked at Jimmy, who whispered, "I'll explain." Tim put the pistol on a shelf by the door, the shotgun on a bookshelf in the office, and took the rifle into the kitchen near the back door. They were all out of reach of the kids, but quick to grab if needed. "I keep one in my truck. Who here can use a gun?" Every person raised their hand, which made Tim laugh. "I guess we are still in Texas," Andy joked. Andy reminded the group that Tim had good reasons to worry about how Larry or any other man who hurts women might react after what had happened. Patty replied, "I agree. We need to be careful. Those animals might try to hurt anyone they think is helping their partner." Cassie agreed. "Eric, He might blame you for getting him arrested. We should go home. Lock all the doors and windows. Set the alarm. We need to hide a few of our guns where we can get to them quickly like Tim did. And we have to keep an eye out for anyone acting strange in our neighborhood." When Cassie went to get their kids, Tim put on his jacket and hid a Colt .45 gun in his pocket. "I'll walk you ladies home if that's okay," he said to the girls. They jumped up and down, insisting he stay to see their new dollhouse. Patty said she would make sure the boys got a bath. So Tim left with the doctor and his family. The short walk was quiet, but Tim, Eric, and Cassie were very alert. "It's amazing how a simple 2-block walk makes you notice everything around you," Eric said softly. The boys were already in bed, and Jeannie had read them a story when Tim returned 20 minutes later. After playing with the girls and their dollhouse, he helped them say their night prayers and tucked them in bed. Jeannie smiled at him and then went to the kitchen. She took her ice mask and 2 other pads and went into her room. When Tim got back to the living room, he found everyone gathered in the TV room, playing the audio tape from the night before. It mainly had Karen crying and a phone call to JW where she talked about the meeting on Monday. Tim felt disgusted listening to Karen's complaints, especially since she thought they wouldn't get caught and seemed to believe Tim knew what was happening. JW tried to calm her down, but they didn't talk about anything important. "I bet tonight's tape will be very different," Tim said firmly after they mentioned the meeting. "Just wait for tomorrow's hearing and Larry's arrest. I bet they are planning something right now at my house." No one disagreed. Patty suggested they watch the rest of the video from last night. But Tim, feeling anxious, declared, "No, I want to see who is there. I'll be back in half an hour." Andy quickly looked at the others and said, "Wait, I'm coming with you. I want to see it too, and I don't want you to just go in and take care of the whole bunch if Larry is there." Everyone agreed, so instead of taking Tim's recognizable truck, they drove in Andy's car. 15 minutes later, they parked near Tim's house in front of a vacant home across the street. They counted 6 cars, including Karen's. Tim held out his hand for a bet, but Andy replied he wasn't foolish enough to bet against them being there. Tim suggested they sneak back, check who was inside, and listen in. Andy hesitated, but Tim jumped out of the car and ran across the street with Andy following closely, cursing softly. They slipped away from the road near a small creek and crept through the bushes close to the house. They found a hidden spot behind the chimney and stood by the living room window to watch. Just as they thought, the whole group was inside. Rogers, Slaughter, Ward, Hughes, Allen, Vinton, Barnes, and Karen. Tim took many pictures with his camera, then agreed to leave when Andy asked. Patty asked what they heard. Andy explained, "We didn't catch everything, but we did hear Karen and JW discussing how Tim would never find out, and Karen was worried she might lose her kids." Benton tried to assure her, saying Tim was just trying to trick them into confessing, and if they all stuck to their story, they couldn't be caught. He told her she would get her kids back, and then she could decide if she wanted to let her husband back in or not. Benton also said they should all write statements to share, because then the lawyers could only ask them about those, making it less likely they would forget something important during the hearing. Joe Ward reminded everyone that they needed to stop arguing and focus. "The custody hearing is tomorrow, and the board meeting is the next night. We need to get ready." Jeannie's husband noted his arrest and trial, saying they needed to support him too, or he might confess to get a lighter punishment. Vinton assured him he would help him get off and that they had to stick to their story. Slaughter dismissed the concern for Benton, calling him a worthless person who could ruin everything for them. They left before hearing more, since Karen and JW walked into the kitchen, which was near where they were hiding. Tim grinned and said, "If the recorder worked, we've got them. You 3 need to make sure they are questioned under oath, and we can play the tape after they testify. I have the pictures with the time and date so we can prove they were at my house. If we do that, we will win." Unnoticed by anyone, Jeannie stood quietly in the kitchen doorway. "When it's Larry's turn to talk, I want to be in the front row. I want him and everyone else to see what he did to me while he tries to lie." When she spoke, everyone turned to her. They were surprised by how strong and angry she sounded. Patty asked her if she was sure. She said yes, definitely. Patty then said she would call Larry after Roger and Slaughter. He would be the first poker player to be called. This should surprise them all and give the judge something to think about. Speaking of surprises, David, I want you to be in the audience when the board meeting starts with your tape recorder. Tim, we won't ask you to come into the closed meeting right away, but knowing you have the tape should speed up the resignations. If they want, you can come in and play the recording. The 5 other board members will get rid of all the workers and remove Allen and Benton from the board, or whatever their lawyer says they can do. Please call me if you need to. I want to confront those people whenever I can, Tim replied eagerly. I would enjoy revealing their wrong actions, and I would say that her bosses forced Karen into bad situations. True or not, this could give her a chance to save herself and hurt them. I am sure she will take it. I want them not just to leave, I want them to lose their teaching certificates, so forget about them resigning. No way, we have got them. I want them all ruined so they can't harm teachers or kids again. Of course, we need to do the same with Larry. The city has a moral code too. We have to get him fired so it shows on his record. Then he won't be able to get good jobs. Is everyone with me? Let's go after them. Everyone nodded excitedly. Jeannie gave him a gentle hug and said, Thanks for looking out for me, Tim. He hugged her back softly and kissed the top of her head. Patty, Andy, and Jimmy exchanged looks. Patty then said, You two are easy to read, so we should keep you apart until this is all over. Then you can do what you want, but not now, okay? They nodded but didn't pull away from each other until Patty spoke again. Tim, the first video is of Karen and JW, then Karen, JW, and Steve, and then Hughes joins in. It's disturbing to watch, but the words they recorded are definitely revealing. If we play the sound even without the video, they will all lose their teaching licenses and might even go to jail. It will be hard, but you need to watch. Jeannie said, Then I will watch too. Patty looked confused, but Jeannie stood strong with a determined look on her face. They wanted to use the TV room. Jimmy started the tape and they all watched. Jeannie sat by Tim and held his hand as one awful scene after another played out. When Karen left after the 3 of them shared her, they made fun of her mean husband. Jeannie felt Tim getting tense, so she held him tighter, soothing him with gentle words. The sight of the beautiful cheerleader, who was hurt so badly that her face had bruises and her eye was swollen, was shocking. It touched Tim deeply. After it finished, they talked about how to use pieces of the video without putting Tim in trouble. Jeannie held on to him and rested her head on his shoulder. Tim became lost in his thoughts of revenge, but Jeannie carefully stood up and pulled him to follow her. When the others looked at them, she saw Patty's disapproving look. She firmly said, We won't be close in public and we'll keep things to ourselves here, but I need him and he needs me for support. So you 3 focus on your own plans. We will see you in the morning. The others exchanged smiles. The shy Jeannie was gone, replaced by the strong woman Tim admired. Following her lead, Tim hesitated as she pulled him into his bedroom. No funny stuff, she said, but I need to hold you, please. Tim just nodded and offered his hand to let her use the bathroom first. She said she had already bathed. All she needed to do was change into her pajamas. Tim returned in his boxers and a t-shirt to find Jeannie wearing soft pajamas in his bed. He looked at her and she said, Please. He climbed in, keeping to his side of the bed. But soon she moved closer, laid her head on his shoulder, and snuggled up with a sigh. The only view he had was of her eye patch and the hurt side of her face, which felt uncomfortable, but he tried to picture her happy and let himself relax. I'm not going to lie, Jeannie. I've dreamed of you cuddling with me before, but tonight is very different. Take what you need from me. I'll be your support, he said. As you wish, Jeannie sleepily replied. It isn't the first time I've had that dream either, Tim. Please hold me. I need you tonight. He kept her close, and she fell asleep quickly. Tim stayed awake a bit longer, going over his plan for Wednesday. As usual, he woke up at 5:30. He carefully moved away from her and left her sleeping on her unhurt side. Tim quietly snuck out of the room to start his day. Things happened fast as Tim got his boys dressed and sent them off to play before they rushed into his room. He turned on cartoons in the living room while making breakfast. He served the boys green eggs and ham with toast. After they were all dressed and warm for the cold morning, they headed out to the truck. Patty showed up wearing a thin robe and reminded him to get the tapes from the house and listen to them soon. She wanted to make changes to the presentation based on what they learned. She also told him that he needed to be at the family court in Georgetown by 1 for the 2 p.m. hearing and that she wanted to hear the tapes just in case. Tim looked her over, winked, and jokingly said she could be in his movie any time. She turned red and tightened her robe. He laughed at her shyness, promising he would be there on time before taking his boys to the truck. After teaching his first 2 classes, Tim stopped by the principal's office to remind Mr. Jones that he was taking the rest of the day off. Mr. Jones looked up from his papers with a sad expression and said, "Good luck, son," before going back to work. Next, Tim visited Chet in his office and closed the door before asking, "What's going on?" Chet replied, "Not much, really. There's not much gossip about your wife or the bad weekend or anything about the board meeting." He continued, "Only one person, the curriculum director, mentioned it. I told her I didn't know enough to comment on it. She said she didn't either and then asked what I was doing this weekend. After I got over my surprise at her invite, I told her I was sure we could find a time that worked for both of us." Chet smiled as he said, "She giggled and told me Friday night would work and to bring a toothbrush." Then he shifted to a serious tone and asked, "How are you holding up, and how is Jeannie?" Tim replied, "I'm okay. She's hurting and feeling weak. I need to gather some evidence on this." He added, "Speaking of evidence, do you know where I can find a type of sniper rifle that can't be traced? Something like a Remington 725, 06 or a 300 mag. Chet considered this a moment and said, "Actually, I do, but who wants to buy one without getting strange looks?" Tim explained, "I'm planning another hunting trip to West Texas next year. I want to get the rifle now to practice before we go. A man needs a good rifle for long-range shooting." Chet nodded and smiled, saying, "Is tomorrow soon enough?" After leaving the high school, Tim drove by the elementary school and saw Karen's car parked in her spot. He went home but found Benton's car in the driveway. Great, he thought, realizing Karen was meeting with her lawyer at their house before the hearing. I can't get the tapes now. Worried that he might lose custody without the tapes, he drove to Patty's house to tell her what was happening. She was less worried, believing the judge would accept Tim's plea based on the situation. But Tim still knew it would be harder to win the final custody hearing. Since he knew where Karen and her lawyer would be, Tim called his private investigator and asked him to get the tapes and replace them while everyone was at court. His PI said it would be done as soon as they left, and he would have someone bring the tapes to the courthouse. When Tim and his lawyer arrived at court, Karen and Barry were already there, and a group of people sat behind them, smiling at Tim when he glanced their way. The judge explained the hearing's purpose: to decide the best temporary living situation for the 2 boys. She noted that this was a legal matter, but would be less formal because the focus was on the children's best interests. After opening statements, the judge asked Patty to present Tim's case. Patty argued that Tim should have temporary custody of the boys. She mentioned that Tim's coaching duties were over, so he could pick them up from daycare early. She also highlighted his strong bond with his sons and good parenting skills. In contrast, she pointed out that Karen often left their boys with babysitters, some qualified and some not, while spending time with other men. Patty used a recent incident to show how Karen's negligence could have left the boys without a parent for days if Tim hadn't stepped in. The judge had received copies of statements from witnesses that Karen's lawyer would call, and she was surprised that Patty was pursuing the case so vigorously. But Patty shocked everyone with her next words. "Your Honor, we just read the statements from the men in this room, and my client wants to hear from them and Mrs. Kelly. He wants to be sure he understands the situation fully." With that, she called John William Rogers as her first witness. As JW was being sworn in, the wives of Barry, Frank, Joe, and John walked into the small courtroom and took seats in the back row. The looks on their husbands' faces were worth the trouble of being there. Oh no. If there was ever a day to show how people could express their feelings, it was today. It only took one phone call from Jeannie to Jamie, the wife of Frank Hughes, to start a big mess. Jeannie said she needed to talk to someone whose husband was there because the story felt strange but possible. Jamie told her the story her husband told her, saying it was true. But when Jeannie mentioned that Karen was there with the men, that was enough to bring the other women to the hearing room, looking very angry. It turned out that these men did not tell their wives that Mrs. Kelly was at the poker game and spent the night with them in the boathouse. Patty guided the men like she was leading them down a fancy path, getting them to recall the stories they had prepared and written down, with just enough changes to seem believable. Tim's face stayed calm, but he leaned in to show he was interested in what they were saying. After those three men, Patty called Larry Barnes. As he sat down and took the oath, Jeannie Barnes walked in carefully and took a seat in the front row behind him. The judge noticed her painful look and frowned at Larry, who looked pale and avoided eye contact. Jeannie's hard expression made Larry nervous, and his shaky answers showed it. Still, he was on the record now. Next, a surprise witness came in. Mary Benton, usually calm and in control, looked very nervous. He tried to object, but he had his own sworn statement, so the judge allowed him to speak. He said things like, "I was drinking, so I'm maybe not clear." Patty helped him by reminding him of his written statement. Sweat poured down his face as it turned red from embarrassment. His wife's happy look showed the judge everything he needed to know. Lastly came Karen. She was dressed simply and looked like a good mother and teacher. She spoke softly about being innocent and wronged by her angry husband. She claimed nothing upset him and ended with tears on her cheeks, looking very sad. The judge seemed touched, as did Tim, who called his lawyer to the table before Jeannie left. Patty returned and started asking more questions. "Miss Kelly, you say nothing inappropriate happened with these men, right?" "Yes." "And this was your first time with them, correct?" Karen seemed surprised, but answered yes. Patty asked her why she got babysitters for her kids to go to basketball games where her husband was coaching. Patty handed over a list of babysitter dates to the judge and to Karen. Karen turned pale and shot a glare at Benton before answering. "I wasn't with those men. I went shopping with other wives. I don't know where they got that idea." Then, just as she finished speaking, 5 high school girls who were on the list walked in and sat near the wives. Patty went back to her briefcase and brought the babysitter's statements to the judge, asking to add them to the records and offering to bring the girls in to speak. Benton disagreed strongly, but the judge said Karen opened the door with her comments. Karen looked even paler, but she tried to keep smiling at the girls. The girls gave her angry looks, and Tim noticed his wife's growing panic. He saw that the men were starting to look worried too. "Miss Kelly, please read Sharon Malden's statement about when she babysat for you on December 27th and 28th. Karen complied slowly after the judge insisted. The statement said that Coach Rogers set up the babysitting on December 27th, telling Sharon he was taking Mrs. Kelly to the basketball game where Mr. Kelly was coaching. He called again the next day, and Sharon babysat for them again. He told her that Mrs. Kelly was going to the game with him and some parents. Karen reluctantly read more of Sharon's statement. It said that Coach Rogers arranged for her to babysit on a Friday in February, telling Sharon he and Coach Slaughter would pick her up after school, take her to the house, and bring her home later, likely around midnight. Sharon also said that Mrs. Kelly was ready to leave with them those times. "Miss Kelly, do you still say you were shopping with friends those December dates?" Karen glared at the men, adjusted her dress, straightened up, and said defiantly, "Okay, I did leave with them, but they dropped me off, and then I went shopping with Beth, Coach Slaughter's wife. This is just another misunderstanding." Patty looked at Karen with sympathy, shook her head, and told the judge that Miss Kelly didn't need to be here, even though the lawyer hadn't brought the tapes. Next, she called her last witness, Mr. Kelly. After Tim swore to tell the truth, Patty asked him about the events from that Friday and what proof he had against the many witnesses who had already spoken. Tim answered that he didn't need to argue with their stories right now. Instead, he just wanted to show that his wife often did not take care of their children. She would leave them with babysitters every time his team had an away game to do who knows what. He continued, "Your Honor, after each game, when I had breakfast with my wife, she would ask me about the game. When I asked how her night was, she told me it was a quiet night with our sons. Now, we know that wasn't true. I doubt the stories told by my wife and the other men about that Friday night. I plan to show proof during my divorce case and custody hearing. But for today, I just need to prove that I am the better choice for custody in the meantime. If my wife gets custody while I'm not living at home, I worry that her neglect might continue or even get worse. I am concerned about our sons in her care." The judge dismissed Tim and turned back to the defense. Benton made a passionate argument, and then Karen took the stand again to say that she was a caring mother who had never been called negligent before. She wanted to keep her kids with her while she and Tim figured things out. She believed Tim's anger and worries would soon fade, and he would come home. The judge didn't believe her story. There were many signs that Karen had left their children with young girls so she could be with other men. She had also lied to Tim about what she was doing that night. The men's stories didn't hold up well, but that would be dealt with later. The judge gave temporary custody to Tim and set a date for the permanent custody hearing in 2 weeks. The judge looked directly at Karen as she explained that she didn't believe the arguments made for her. Karen had used babysitters at least 10 times. She didn't tell Tim when he asked her about the care for their children, and she had changed her story when asked about the babysitters. Karen was upset. She glared at her allies, and they glared back at Tim. Tim matched the smirk they gave him when he first walked in. If they only knew what I have planned, he thought, their time will come. Benton turned to the other 6 quietly and said, "We underestimated him. We need to look at other, more serious options. Meet at my office at 7 tonight. And don't worry about what your wives say. Just be there." Dinner at the Horseman's was cheerful. Jeannie made spaghetti with meat sauce and meatballs, a big salad, a bowl of fresh fruit, and gelato for dessert. Andy, Eric, Casey, and their kids added to the happy atmosphere. After the meal, the men went to Jimmy's office to listen to the recordings from the previous night that Pat had dropped off. As they listened, Tim became angrier and more worried. "It's unbelievable!" Tim shouted. "Their arrogance and lack of any guilty feelings leave me speechless." Andy spoke softly, warning, "That's true. But did you notice the threat in the promise Benton made to Katie? She said she would ruin them if she didn't get her sons back." Vincent agreed, saying they would do anything to make that happen. Rogers told her not to worry. "There are many ways to handle this. Some might see this as harmless advice, but Tim, it could also be a warning to you." "I hope they come after me," Tim replied. "They don't know what I can do." "Just make sure your boys don't get stuck in the middle, Tim," Dr. Eric warned. Tim replied, "They won't hurt the boys. Karen would make sure nothing happens to them. If Andy is right, they will try to catch me alone or with someone who isn't the boys." They returned to listening to the recordings from the phone and their home. The talks proved that they did what they said they hadn't, and they agreed to create false stories before the hearing. When the recordings finished, Jimmy said, "They're in big trouble. At the hearing, Judge Williams will hear about their lies and send them to jail for lying under oath." Tim then started the video recordings of Karen with JW, Steve, and Frank. By the time they were done watching, Tim felt strong against Karen's charms. Following Andy's lead, they discussed their plan for the Board of Trustees meeting the next night. After sharing ideas, they agreed on actions that could lead to the firing of the educators involved and the removal of 2 board members for bad behavior. They even made a special plan for Larry Barnes to not only get him fired, but also to lengthen his time in jail. Thursday was bright and sunny, reflecting Tim's good mood. Jeannie had spent the night with him again. They cuddled and woke up snuggled beside each other as he stood by the bed, looking down at her. Tim noticed that using ice and heat had helped reduce the swelling on her face over the last day. Her calm sleeping looked like the medicine had worked to lessen her pain in her face, ribs, and lower back. From one side, she was still the lovely blonde he admired, but from the other side, she looked scary, like something from a horror movie. Because of this, she tried to stay inside and away from others. Eric kept coming to check on her so she could have privacy while she healed. At school, Tim found out that both JW and Steve had quit their jobs that morning to take higher-paying jobs at a wealthy school in West Texas. Beth had also quit to teach there, and all 3 got time off from the superintendent. Tim wasted no time and called Andy. He said he wouldn't let them quit and leave like that. He wanted to hold them accountable. He asked Andy if he should file a complaint against them. Andy explained that he had talked to David Pierce, who was his friend and the head of the school board. They were going to look into the claims of bad behavior, like blackmail and harassment, against Rogers, Slaughter, Hughes, Ward, Allen, and Benson. Tim heard that there was a meeting at Benton's house at noon. Benton was free since his wife had left him and was getting a divorce. Doesn't that make you feel bad for him? Andy asked with a hint of sarcasm. Tim shrugged it off. When should I be there? David would start the meeting at 7 p.m. They would review what happened, talk about the allegations, and give the accused a chance to speak privately. After that, they would go back to the public meeting, where evidence would be looked at and a vote would take place. Andy said they might be asked to give evidence in either the private or public session. After discussing all of this, they would vote, and then the regular meeting would go on. They planned to meet in front of the administration building at 6:30 to see when they should share their evidence. Tim agreed and went back to his regular day. Chet met him at the field house as the sports period began. He quickly updated the athletes on coaches Slaughter and Rogers stepping down. He answered their questions, then told them that Coach Kelly would take charge of the off-season fitness program. There was cheering and clapping at that news. The kids were excited to jump into the field after Coach Kelly shared his new plans to help them get bigger, faster, and stronger. The workout was lively and full of energy. Tim felt happy with the positive support from the kids and his fellow coaches. His afternoon classes went smoothly, and he left right after the last one ended at 3 p.m. so he could pick up his sons. The daycare director, Mrs. Gonzalez, walked out with him. He held Mark in one arm and Patrick in the other. While they talked about a superhero costume party coming up, Tim noticed a pickup truck parked across the street. Something about it made him uneasy. Suddenly, as it moved forward, he saw a glint and a rifle sticking out from the driver's side window. In a hurry, he grabbed his sons and pushed Mrs. Gonzalez away. The boys flew in different directions as he shouted a warning. Just then, he felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder and heard a gunshot. Another shot rang out, and he felt a pull at his left side, but he ignored the pain and ran for his truck to protect his sons. He heard a third shot just before reaching the truck. That one missed him, but it hit something behind him. Quickly, he grabbed the gun he kept in his truck. Just then, another bullet struck the windshield, narrowly missing him. He stepped outside when something hit his lower leg, but he managed to aim his gun at the shooter and fired 3 shots into the truck. The rifle disappeared, and the truck sped away. Feeling weak, Tim leaned against his truck and noticed blood on his clothes. Turning around, he saw his sons being held by Mrs. Solis. They were crying and yelling for him. He wanted to reach them, but his legs wouldn't support him anymore. He fell to the ground just as a police car skidded to a stop in front of his truck. Knowing his boys were safe, he let himself drift into darkness. Later, Tim became somewhat aware of beeping and buzzing sounds. He heard voices and opened his eyes. He realized he was hooked up to machines and surrounded by monitors. His mouth felt dry, and his neck and shoulder ached when he tried to lift his head. He heard someone gasp and turned his head to see who it was. A woman grabbed his hand and exclaimed, "He's awake!" It was Jeannie, but she looked different. Her face was clear and she wasn't wearing an eye patch. She looked very sweet, but he remembered that her husband had hurt her before. He wanted to talk and ask how she was, but she hurried over to him and whispered that everyone was fine and he should rest. He closed his eyes and slipped back into darkness. When he opened them again, he saw medical staff, both men and women, gathered around his bed. He focused on the man in a white coat standing closest to him. He tried to ask why he was there, but his mouth was too dry to speak. A nurse in blue scrubs held a straw to his lips, letting him sip a little water before taking it away. The doctor asked if he knew why he was in the hospital. Tim's confused mind searched for an answer, but nothing made sense. He managed to whisper no, and the nurse gave him another sip of water. Dr. James asked what he could remember. Tim thought back and remembered he had kids and had been picking them up from daycare when something happened. But what was it? Suddenly, he remembered. He had been shot. He blurted that out and then asked in a panic, "Are my sons okay?" The doctor reassured him that they were fine and said he would heal and be better in a week or two. "We're happy to see you awake and that you remember your sons. Those are good signs and we expect you to recover fully," the doctor said. "At first it was touch and go because you lost a lot of blood. But you're young and strong, so you're doing well so far. You will need some therapy to regain your strength, but you'll improve every day." Tim asked, "When can I see my sons?" The doctor and nurses exchanged looks, and Dr. James said, "Right now, let's focus on making you stronger. We'll set up a visit when you're better." Feeling dazed, Tim felt uneasy. Where are they? Who are they with? We don't have all the details about your family, Mr. Kelly. We are your medical team. Your lawyers asked us to call them when you woke up. Your sister just left to take care of some things. Nurse Phillips will let them know you're awake, and hopefully they can give you the information you need, the doctor explained. Tim nodded, and as the team began to leave, he drifted back to sleep, wondering why his sister was there instead of with her kids at the ranch. The sound of familiar voices brought him slowly back to reality. He heard a medical person explaining his condition. He's still weak from losing blood, but the infected wound in his leg is responding well to the treatment. The other injuries are also healing, so we're hopeful, but he needs a lot of rest. I can give you 15 minutes with him, but then you'll have to leave. Can I stay? I promise I won't disturb him, but I want to watch over him like I have since the shooting, a female voice he recognized asked. Tim opened his eyes a little and looked around at the people in his room. Patty, Jimmy, Andy, and Jeannie. He wondered why his wife wasn't there, but then his memory returned, along with the beeping sounds from the machines around him. The nurse rushed to his side, but the noise faded as he focused on his friends. "It's good to see you," he croaked. "Thanks for coming." The nurse let him sip some water through a straw, and he saw tears in his friend's eyes. "We thought we lost you," Patty said softly, trying to smile. Tim replied, "I'm tougher than a few bullets. Are my boys okay?" Andy answered, "They are, thanks to you. If you hadn't pushed Mrs. Gonzalez away, she and Mark might have been hit. The first bullet grazed your shoulder, which was very close to Mark, and the second shot would have hit Mrs. Gonzalez. She and the police say you're a hero." Tim didn't want to hear the praise and asked again, "But my sons are all right?" "Yes," Andy reassured him. "They were scared but unhurt. They were mostly worried about you. Mrs. Gonzalez took them inside and looked after them while the EMTs helped you and the police looked into what happened. She let them watch through the window because they were really shaken up seeing you fall. They calmed down when your wife came and took them with her when the ambulance left." Seeing Tim's anger at that, Andy continued, "I know you don't want their mother with them, but it all happened so quickly and she took them away. We talked to the police about the custody order and thought about having a judge take them from her. We wanted to keep them safe for you, but we knew that wouldn't work. She was the best option." Tim felt upset. "So, her boyfriend nearly kills me, almost hitting Mark, and she just happened to show up to take them? And you think that's a good idea?" Jimmy, ignoring Tim's anger, said, "Did you see the shooters? That's good. The police will want to talk to you soon. They already know one of the people involved, but not who actually shot you." Tim's anger grew, and the machines around him beeped louder. The nurse guided the three friends out, but agreed to let his sister stay if she helped keep him calm. "So, you're the sister who's been here day and night?" Tim asked. "That was the only way they would let me come into your room," Jeannie said. "Well, that's interesting." He felt so weak he didn't know what kind of face he was making. But Jeannie smiled back, leaning over to give him a gentle touch. "There's plenty of time for that when you feel better." "I doubt you could handle my demands right now," she whispered as she sat by his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Really? Pretty decent for someone who's been shot 3 times. I think it's because of whatever is in the drip," he replied. Just then, there was a light knock at the door, and 2 tall men in suits walked in. One had a badge on his belt and was holding his Stetson hat. The other man showed Tim his badge as they entered and said, "Coach, you might remember me. My son is Abe. He was on your basketball team last year." Tim nodded and said, "It's good to see you, Mr. Wellington. I wish it was under better circumstances." The 2 men nodded to Jeannie, and she nodded back. The other man introduced himself as a Texas Ranger, Jim Boyd. Tim nodded and said, "I'd shake your hand, but I have tubes coming from both of mine." "We see that," Boyd replied. "Can you tell us how this happened? I assume you know the basics." Tim began. "I went to daycare to pick up my sons. The director followed us outside and was telling me about an upcoming party. I saw a pickup truck parked on the next block. It wasn't there when I arrived, and it looked out of place. I watched it as it pulled up the street towards us. The back window was rolled down, and I saw something shiny that looked like a gun barrel as it got closer. When I realized it was a gun barrel pointed at us, I was holding my sons. 1 on each arm. I threw them to the side and pushed the director out of the way. I felt a sting on my left shoulder near my neck and heard a gunshot. I ran towards my truck to draw the fire away from my sons. I got hit in the hip and heard another shot, but I kept going. I may have heard another shot, but it didn't hit me. I reached my truck, and a bullet shattered the windshield as I got my gun from under the front seat. I stepped out to fire at the pickup, which was at an angle to me, and my leg was hit. I think I fired 3 shots as the truck sped off and then turned to check on my sons. Mrs. Gonzalez was holding them on the ground, and they were crying but seemed okay. I started to go to them, and then I fell. The world went dark. The next thing I remember is being in a room with many doctors and machines beeping around me. The ranger and detective looked at each other. Then the ranger said, "You handled that very well. Mr. Kelly, it's as if you were trained, but your records don't show any military or police training. Your story matches what others saw. One witness was watering her plants across the street, and the other is the daycare director. Coach, did you see the shooter?" Tim had to make a choice and replied, "Not really. I was focused on the gun barrel. I think I saw a man with blonde hair, but his face was blocked by the gun. The 2 men in the front seat had dark hair, and there was a 4th person in the back, but I only saw a shape." "Can you identify any of them?" asked the detective. "I'm a bit hazy from the medicine I'm on. I might be able to after I'm off the painkillers," Tim answered. "Do you have any leads?" "Yes," said the ranger. "We'll tell you in a few minutes. But let me ask you this. Do you know anyone who would want to harm you?" "Actually, yes. My wife was involved with several men. When I found out, I left the house, but I kept it wired to record what was said. I heard her and the men planning to make sure she got custody of our kids, even though she shouldn't be raising them. They decided they might have to get rid of me because I had proof that could ruin them. My wife told them she didn't care what they did, but if they didn't make sure she got the kids, she'd ruin them. I have more evidence, but I need to talk to my lawyers before I say more." The ranger replied, "That's enough for now. What you've told us matches what we know, including the identities of the men." Detective Wellington spoke up, "So you won't be surprised when I tell you the truck was borrowed from a friend by John William Rogers. The friend came forward after he found bullet holes in his truck after hearing about the shooting. Rogers and 3 of the other men your wife was involved with have disappeared. We've put out a lookout for them and are watching the others because we're worried about your safety. The sheriff has guards on duty at all times, and the hospital security team is alerted. We believe you are safe here, but please stay alert. If you see anything odd, press the call button, and our guard will be there quickly. Remember that it could be anyone, not just them. It might be someone helping them or someone they hired." Tim nodded and then said, "I have a couple of questions. How was my wife, who just lost custody of our kids, there right after I was shot? I'm not saying she knew I would be shot, but that looks really suspicious. Why does she have our boys now? The detective said they were wondering about that too. They found out she was with a friend, a teacher from her school who lives close by. After the hearing, they heard the sirens. They knew your boys were at the daycare, so they hurried over. Her friend supports her story about why she has custody. Your friends and I talked about the situation. At that time, we didn't know if you would live or die. We believed the boys had already seen way too much trauma. We didn't want them to be placed with strangers by social services, which would happen if a parent wasn't there. We thought it would be better for their mother to comfort and care for them. When she tried to take them, she stated she would bring them to her parents' home, 50 miles away, where they would be safe from any danger." Wellington looked at Jeannie and said, "Coach, I know you are upset with her and you have every right to be. But my partner, who was your good friend, told me it was the right call. Under the circumstances, I've never seen a woman so upset. The officers had to hold her back so the EMTs could help you. She was screaming, 'No, no, please, Tim, don't die, I love you,' over and over again. I had to order a female sergeant to help calm her down because she was making your boys even more scared. Mrs. Gonzalez took them inside until we could get her controlled. When she calmed down, the boys relaxed and were eager to go with her after the ambulance took you away. Her friend said she would drive them to her parents' house since they were too sad to go by themselves. So as much as you might be upset, I really think we did the right thing. When you are better, you can go back to court. But until those people who hurt you are caught, it's safer for the boys to avoid you." After they left, Tim turned to Jeannie and thanked her for being with him. Jeannie looked worried when she warned him. "Tim, I heard what they said about keeping an eye out for anyone strange. I'm worried about the night nurse who was on duty while you were still asleep. She was rude to me and questioned why I was there. She acted like she didn't want to be your nurse. The others treated you like a hero and were very gentle. She was rough and didn't seem to care about checking on you. It was during her shift that you almost died a few days after they brought you in. Do you know her?" Tim said he didn't remember seeing her. He wanted to be awake when she came in that night. Jeannie said she refused to leave his side and stayed awake whenever Nurse Simpson was on duty. Tonight was the start of another 3-day shift for her. Tim told her to go home and get some rest so she could stay awake later. She hesitated but agreed and kissed his forehead gently. After she left, Tim napped until his doctor came in the late afternoon. The doctor had the IVs taken out and prescribed pain pills instead. He urged Tim to take the pills on time because it would help him heal faster. The doctor wouldn't let Tim have the catheter removed yet because his leg wasn't ready to be used, but he said Tim could start physical therapy tomorrow, which would help him recover. Tim replied that he was already good at using a bedpan and would quickly learn to use the urine bottle. The doctor smiled and shook his head. He ordered the catheter be removed, trusting Tim wouldn't overdo it with the physical therapist. Tim thanked him gratefully. Jeannie returned at 6:30, just before the nurses came in to check his charts. Tim noticed the new nurse gave Jeannie a dirty look before glaring at him. After Nurse Phillips left, he asked Nurse Simpson, "Do I know you? You look familiar." She turned to him quickly, looking guilty. "I don't think so. I was your nurse for a few days while you were in a coma, but you probably don't remember me." Tim kept pushing, saying, "It seems like I've seen you before. You don't have kids in high school, do you?" "No, I don't have kids. I'm not married and never have been." Tim shrugged. "Okay, I'll keep thinking. I know I've seen you around, maybe with someone I know or in a store. I usually remember faces, so I'm sure it'll come to me." Nurse Simpson looked annoyed by his last comment and shot another glare at Jeannie before leaving the room. Tim saw her at the nurse's station later, talking happily on the phone. She didn't come back until 9 when she brought his pain pill and a glass of water. She also offered Jeannie a glass of water with a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. Jeannie took it, thanked her, and had a sip. Tim took the pills and the water, gulping down the pills in one large swallow. Nurse Simpson seemed satisfied, turned, and left. As soon as she was gone, Tim spit out the water into his glass and showed Jeannie the pills still in his hand. Jeannie did the same with the water. "What should we do now?" he asked. Jeannie replied, "I'll pour the water into plastic cups in the restroom and hide them in the shower. You hide the pills in your bed, then we'll both play sick. We may be wrong, but we have to stick to our plan." Something didn't feel right about her, and they had to be careful. 10 minutes later, Simpson came back to find Tim sleeping in his bed and Jeannie slumped in her chair, fast asleep. Simpson smiled, took a syringe out of her pocket, and rolled up Tim's sleeve to give him an injection. "What are you giving him?" asked a rough voice from the doorway. Simpson jumped, quickly replied, "Just something to help him sleep. He needs rest to get better." "That's odd," the voice said. "There's nothing in his file about any injection. I think I need to call the doctor to check. Hand me the syringe and sit in that chair." When she didn't respond right away, he took the syringe from her. Tim and Jeannie woke up and stared at Simpson. Tim asked coldly, "So, who are you working for? My guess is Jeannie's husband, Larry Barnes. Or is it Benton, or maybe you're working for Rogers?" The nurse looked scared and said, "I don't know any of those names." An orderly showed up with hospital security. He took the syringe, the glasses of water, and the pills to the lab for tests. The police officer and hospital security asked the nurse what was in the syringe. She wouldn't say, so the officer warned her. "You don't have to answer my questions. You have the right to remain silent." He read her the Miranda rights. When he finished, he said, "With those rights read to you, I still think we'll find some kind of poison in that syringe meant to harm Mr. Kelly. We might also find something to sedate them both in the water and the pills. When we do, you will be charged with attempted murder. Not only will you lose your nursing license, but you could spend 10 to 20 years in prison. Your best chance is to tell the truth. We can talk to the DA for you, but if you want a lawyer, we'll take you to jail first and then you can get a lawyer." "So what do you want to do?" Simpson broke down crying for a few minutes, then shouted defiantly, "They both deserve to die. They were having an affair. You broke Larry's heart. You lied and got him locked up, and you made up lies that got Larry and Steve fired. I might end up in prison, but they will get what's coming to them eventually. For a moment, Tim showed his anger. You tell your boyfriend Larry that the next time I see him, he won't get away. Got that? Jeannie stepped closer and, in a low voice, warned, If I see him first, I'll make sure he pays. Officer Dan watched the threats fly back and forth, then told her to stand up. He handcuffed her and called for the police team waiting outside to take her to jail. When the lab team arrived, Detective Wellington came in. He thanked Tim and Jeannie for being alert and sharing their concerns. We're increasing the security here, and we'll have a car outside all night. We take her threat very seriously, and so should you, Tim responded. Oh, we do. I want my gun or another gun in my bed from now on. Can you make that happen? Wellington looked around to check no one was watching, then pulled a gun from his holster and handed it to Tim. Keep it hidden, and don't tell anyone where you got it. I won't, Tim replied. Now, where are you in the investigation? Who are you searching for? Have you found anyone? The detective said, No, but we have a lookout for all 4 suspects. Their homes are being watched along with their associates. The 4 suspects are Barnes, Rogers, Slaughter, and Benton. Your wife and sons are with her parents. The police there are watching and protecting them. They will respond right away if anyone comes to their house or if Mrs. Kelly leaves. So far, only her mother has left the house to get groceries. We got permission to listen in on the calls of all 8 suspects, including your wife. That's already started. Wellington asked, Are you sure you didn't see the shooter or anyone else in the truck? That would really help us find them. Without breaking eye contact, Tim replied, If I said he looked a lot like Larry Barnes, but I couldn't see his whole face, would that change anything? He's already a suspect, and I think the others were probably in the truck too. Give me a day or two. I might remember more if I really see them again. Wellington assured them he would keep them updated and left. Jeannie asked, Was it Larry who shot you? Tim said he wasn't sure, but leaned closer and whispered, Yes, he was the shooter. Rogers, Benton, and Slaughter were in the truck watching. He gently pushed her back and warned, I care about you as much as I do about myself. If Larry is involved, he might come after you too. He's probably more angry at you than at me. So don't go anywhere alone without someone to protect you, okay? The days went by quickly with visits from friends, teachers, and parents. The principal, several teachers, students, and many of the athletes he had coached all stopped by to check in on him. His lawyers took turns coming each day, but Jeannie stayed by his side except when she needed to clean up and change clothes because of the threat made by Nurse Simpson. Tim was at home when Jeannie arrived with 2 Leos, who helped her inside. Tim's family had come to visit for 2 days, so the nurses knew Jeannie wasn't really his sister. The head nurse smiled and asked if it was okay for Jeannie to stay, even though she wasn't family. After that, the nurses treated her like a wife. They gave her a rollaway bed and meals. But Tim's real wife was missing. She didn't come by or call. On the 4th day, Tim called his in-laws' house and spoke with his father-in-law. Good afternoon, Gramps. How are you? Tim asked. I'm fine. We have Karen and the boys with us. They are safe and doing well. How are you? Gramps replied. We heard you are getting better, but I haven't heard more in a few days. Tim replied, I don't know why you haven't heard anything. Karen is listed as my spouse so she can get updates from the nurses. And what about my wife? His father-in-law asked about Tim's family. Tim said, My sons and Karen are on my family list. You can visit any time, and I'd like to see my son soon. I'm up and about doing physical therapy. I'm almost ready to be released. I think seeing me like this would help them forget the last time they saw me lying there with blood everywhere and people helping me after getting shot. Tim's voice broke with emotion as he spoke about it. His father-in-law responded, We're not sure they're ready for that. They're still scared after what they saw. Maybe later would be better, he suggested. Okay, let me talk to them. I want to reassure them, Tim said firmly. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Tim heard whispers before his father-in-law said, Call back tomorrow and we'll see. Tim had enough of that. How about this? If you don't let me talk to my sons now, the police will come tomorrow to take the kids and arrest Karen for breaking the custody rules. You might never see them again. Which do you prefer? I can tell my lawyer to go ahead and you'll be in a lot of trouble. Or you can let me speak to my sons and bring them to see me tomorrow. Your choice." The phone went quiet again. Then Tim heard Karen say, "Patrick, your daddy is on the phone. Do you want to talk to him?" Patrick jumped up, grabbed the phone, and started talking quickly. "Daddy, are you okay? You got hurt. We were so scared. They wouldn't let us come see you. They said you might die. Are you okay now?" In the background, Tim heard Mark say, "I want to talk to Daddy too. I want to hug him." Tears filled Tim's eyes, but he replied excitedly, "Daddy is doing good. Those bad people hurt him, but he's getting better. The police will catch them, and they will go to prison for a long time. Daddy wants to see you both. When are you coming to see me?" "I have to stay here a bit longer," Tim explained, "but soon I'll come to get you." "Would you like that?" Patrick shouted. "Yes, Daddy is coming home." "Patrick, can I talk to Mark now?" Tim asked. When Mark took the phone, he said seriously, "Hi, Daddy, I love you. When I come see you, I'll bring my doctor kit and make you all better." "Thank you, my special little doctor. I know you can fix me up." "When are you coming?" Tim asked. Mark replied eagerly, "When can we see Daddy? Mommy told me to come help you get better." "Soon," his mom answered. "Can I talk to Daddy now?" Mark said, handing the phone back to her. "I love you, Daddy," he said. "I love you too, Mark. Be a good boy." Tim then heard Karen's soft voice. "Tim, can we talk? The boys are with my parents now." Tim answered coolly, "What do you want, Karen?" "I'm really sorry about everything," she said, her voice shaky. Tim could tell she was nervous, but he felt angry. "What are you sorry for, Karen? Is it because you hurt our marriage? Or because I found out? What about the fact that your boyfriend shot me? Tell me, what do you feel sorry about?" "I'm sorry for everything," she replied, her voice wavering. "I can't believe this all happened, but I know it did." "Would you like to see the videos, Karen?" Tim asked. "If you don't believe it, would seeing the videos you were making with those people help you remember?" "Tim, how do you know about that?" Karen asked. "I warned you that I knew everything. I told you the only way was to be honest, but you still lied. I don't know which makes me angrier, your lies or what you did. I promise you and your friends will pay for this." Tim paused because Jeannie was putting her finger on his lips and shaking her head. He realized she was reminding him that the conversation was being recorded. He couldn't say those things. Taking a deep breath, he spoke calmly. "I'm sorry, Karen, I lost my temper. Let's settle down. What do you really want to talk about?" "Oh, Tim, I'm such a fool. I'm so sorry," she cried. "I know, Karen, I know," Tim said, cutting her off. "Let's put away your guilt for a bit and talk about something else. Can you bring the boys to see me tomorrow? I'd really like to see them. That's what I wanted to tell you, dear. I want to, but I'm scared that the men who hurt you are still looking for you. I worry the boys might get hurt. Can't you understand that? I don't want to keep them from you, but I'm scared." "Why, Karen? How do you know they are still looking for me?" "Have you talked to them?" Tim asked. Karen didn't say anything, just stayed quiet for a little too long. So Tim went on. "If you have talked to them and don't tell me, then you could get in a lot of trouble. You might not see your sons again until they are grown. And who knows if they would even want to see you after 20 years in jail. Think about that for a moment. Have you been talking to them? There's no use lying. I can get a court order to check your parents' phone records before the next hearing. I'll tell the Rangers if you have. Tim, I swear I haven't called them. Barry called me at home the night after you were shot and said they had taken care of my problem for good. My parents were right beside me, so I tried to make it sound like a friendly chat. I told him you had been shot 3 times and had to go through several surgeries but were expected to get better. I said not to worry. They would come up with another plan. I told him with all my heart that I love you and I'm praying for your full recovery. They should be too. He laughed and repeated this out loud. Others in the room laughed too. He said, "Sure, babe, we get it," and hung up. The day before yesterday, they called again and said that Larry had someone in the hospital ready to deal with you. Soon. No one was here except the boys who were playing in another room. I told him I never said I wanted you harmed and that they should stop whatever they planned right away. He laughed and said if I changed my mind, they would call it off. He said he would see me soon and hung up. And then, my loving wife, you did call the police, right? You reported that someone would try to harm me, didn't you? Tim asked, knowing the answer but wanting it to be clear. So did you tell them to stop? I told them to stop and they said they would. she replied. Did they? Tim asked. Actually, your honest and caring friends did try to get me last night, even after they assured you they wouldn't. A nurse that Larry is involved with tried to knock me out with something in my drink and then tried to hurt me with a needle. Have you thought that maybe they can't be trusted? My loving wife? Maybe it's time for you to tell the truth to the police. Or is there more? After a short pause, Karen said, They called me again today to say that their attempt in the hospital failed, but they will keep trying. I was all alone and I yelled at them to stop. I said I didn't want you hurt. I told them again that I love you and that we should stay together and grow old together. I begged them to leave you alone. They laughed at me and said they wouldn't stop until you were dead and that they would come to get me. I told them I wouldn't go, but JW said, Oh, yes, you will, or he won't be the only one dead. Then he told me I would love Mexico, and I cried and told him I wouldn't go. But then they hung up on me. And then you called the police, right? You care about our son's safety, so you called the police and told them about the new threats against us. Is that right? Tim pressed her. Karen began to cry loudly. Tim let her cry for a couple of minutes before steering the conversation back. So, did you call the police about this third threatening call? Karen sniffled and said, No, I'm scared of them. If I tell the police, they might hurt me. So now your friends, whom you betrayed your family for, are threatening to hurt you, and maybe our sons and your parents if you don't go to Mexico with them? Wow, Karen, you sure know how to pick them. What happened to the good girl you used to be? Did they take away every bit of your good sense? Tim didn't understand. Karen cried again. Tim listened for a bit before saying, I'm giving you an hour to pull yourself together and call them. When I call back, you better be talking to a police officer or already have talked to one. One more thing, Karen. If anything happens to my sons, you and your friends will regret it. But I promise it won't be easy for you. Do you understand? Karen's cries turned to loud sobs. Tim said loudly that he would call back in an hour and then hung up. Jeannie spoke calmly to Tim, reminding him that their sons were being watched and anyone who approached them would be arrested, so they were safe. She also reminded him that their conversations were being recorded, so he needed to stay calm and not make threats. Tim shook his head, took a deep breath, and said he would be better from now on. Andy walked into the room just as Tim hobbled back from the bathroom with his walker. Jeannie gave Andy a hug and told him to take good care of Tim while she went to the house to tidy up and change clothes. Tim told her to have a good meal too, but she laughed and said she liked the hospital food because it was helping her lose weight. As she stood in the doorway, Tim looked at her and said, Well, don't lose any more weight. You look perfect just like this. Jeannie rolled her eyes, waved her hand at him, and walked out the door. The woman police officer assigned to protect Tim gave him a little smile and then walked alongside him. Andy and Tim watched as Jeannie walked away, her figure moving gracefully. Andy said, She really is almost perfect, isn't she? If she weren't such a nice person and already attached to one of my friends, I'd be dreaming about her all day and night. Tim replied, Yeah, she's the nicest person out there and she's married, but that doesn't stop me from admiring her amazing looks. Well, now that you've said that, I guess I may have been pretending my thoughts were cleaner than they really are, Andy admitted. They both laughed. Andy was closest when the phone rang, so he picked it up. He told Tim it was the police chief from Karen's hometown. Hello, Chief, Tim said into the phone. I just had an interesting call from your father-in-law and wife. I was glad to hear from her after the way you talked to her earlier. She shared a lot, and I was happy to hear it all, the chief said. We could charge her for getting in the way of our investigation, but I think I'll save that for later if I need it. That's fine with me, Tim replied. I just want the person behind all this to be caught and punished. I'm tired of hiding and waiting. It's time to take action. That's a lively way to say it, Chief Louis replied. But remember, it might be better to have someone from the police handle this instead of a regular person. I know, Tim said, pausing before continuing. But I'm done being hunted, shot at, and drugged. I won't put up with much more before I fight back. You understand that, right? I do. Just make sure you don't rush in without a plan. When a bear fights back, it can scare a lot of people. All right, please let me talk to my lawyer now, Tim said. Here he is, Chief, Tim replied. Good luck with everything. Nice to meet you, Chief said with a laugh. "I hear good things about you as a lawyer." "Thank you, Chief." "How can I help?" Andy asked. "Can you talk some sense into your client? I know he's a good guy, but he can be a bit revengeful when angry. He might do something rash if we don't find these guys soon." "I understand, Chief. We'll do our best. But like you said, he doesn't have much patience," Andy answered. "The faster we catch these guys, the safer everyone will be." The chief promised they were working quickly to catch the criminals and hung up. Andy turned to Tim. "The chief thinks you might be getting too close to losing control, but you can't rush things, okay?" Tim's voice was filled with anger. "I've been shot. Jeannie is hurt badly. They tried to poison us and are now threatening my family. The police can't find them, but those criminals know everything that happens in this hospital and at Karen's parents' house. How long do they expect me to wait until they get to my sons and me? I can't sit idle anymore. When I get out of here, I'm going to take action. I've had enough." Andy sighed, knowing that once Tim was out, he would be hard to stop. He thought about asking the doctors to keep Tim longer, but being here was safer for him than being at home, where he could be in danger. Just then, Chet arrived. He greeted Andy and Tim and sat down in a chair. Once Tim was settled back in bed, the friends relaxed and chatted about what had happened. It turns out Alan and Benton were trying to say they were innocent during a meeting with the school board until Andy played a recording from Tim's house. They exploded with anger, quit their jobs, and stormed out. Their resignations were accepted right after the board returned to the meeting. Warden Hughes was fired for cause, and Rogers and Slaughter were also dismissed, even though they had tried to resign before the meeting. The board rejected their resignations and approved their terminations, reporting their actions to the Education Commissioner. The careers of all four were basically over. They talked about Karen Kelly during the private meeting, but since they thought she might have been forced into her actions, they chose not to fire her just yet. The assistant superintendent for finance became the acting superintendent, and Chet was moved from assistant principal at the high school to acting principal at the elementary school. He said he liked his new job and shared that Karen had resigned due to a family emergency, effective the Friday after Tim was shot. Her resignation was accepted by the temporary superintendent, and someone fresh out of school took her place. There were no plans to take away her teaching certificate. Benton's wife filed for divorce because of his cheating, asking for most of their shared money according to their agreement. Alan's wife didn't have a pre-marriage agreement, but she hired the same lawyer and did things similarly. Slaughter's wife quit her teaching job right away and hadn't been seen since Larry Barnes was suspended from his job after a warrant was issued for him because he missed a court date about charges of hurting his spouse. Jeannie filed for divorce too, but they hadn't managed to serve him with the papers because he was missing. Barnes, Slaughter, Rogers, and Benton were wanted for questioning about Tim's attempted murder, but despite many police efforts, they had vanished. The staff at Tim's place hired private security to watch over their home because they wanted him back. When Tim got out, he was trying to explain to Andy why he wanted to go home instead of staying at Jimmy and Patty's house. He lost his train of thought when a stunning blonde stopped in the doorway with a nervous smile that turned into a smirk when she saw the three men staring at her. She stood with her hand on her hip, wearing tall white heels and posing like a model. Her shiny blue dress fit her tightly and ended mid-thigh. The top showed off her neck and shoulders, while the back was cut low. Chet and Andy jumped up to invite her in and offered their chairs. She walked into the room on her high heels, kissed Chet and Andy on the cheeks, but said she would sit on the bed beside Tim, who was lost for words. She leaned over the bed and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Andy and Chet couldn't help but stare when she leaned over. "Cat got your tongue?" she asked with a playful smile. After a moment, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "Who are you?" She made a cute face and replied, "What do you mean? I just left a few minutes ago and you've already forgotten me." Tim looked her up and down and said, "The pretty blonde I saw a few hours ago was a friend. I've known her for 2 years, but I've never seen her in high heels or red lipstick. I don't think she even has a dress like that." "Who are you then?" Andy and Chet jumped in with silly lines like, "Are you a movie star?" and "Did it hurt when you fell from heaven?" Jeannie smiled, but pretended to be annoyed. "Can a girl wear a dress without getting lame pickup lines?" "Not when she looks like that," Chet answered quietly. Then he added, "Hey, I'm about to go eat at a nice steakhouse, have some drinks, and then go dancing next door. Wouldn't you like to leave this boring hospital and join me? Jeannie turned away from Tim, stepped on a stool, and sat down next to him. She gave the guys a playful look before pulling her dress down a bit and said to Tim, I have a nice offer for company tonight. Can you beat dinner, drinks, and dancing? Or should I go with Chet? Tim leaned to the side, admiring her legs. I don't think they'll let me out to take you dancing, but if you stay, I'll make it worth your time. A few days down the road, your wait will pay off. So I can choose immediate fun tonight or a vague promise of fun later. Can you tell me more? Jeannie asked. Lean closer. I'll whisper in your ear, Tim urged as he spoke softly to her. Andy and Chet watched them with jealousy. Then Tim stopped whispering, playfully flicked his tongue in her ear and nibbled her earlobe. Jeannie turned back to Chet, grinning. Can I have a rain check on that date, Chet? I want to take care of Tim tonight. I never break my promises, so I have to pass. But maybe another time? Jeannie said. Chet laughed. He's fine. There are nurses and doctors everywhere, and he's practically better. Remember, they're letting him go soon? His words were tempting, but his smiling eyes showed he was just teasing. Andy added, How about both of us take you out? A double date to make sure you dance all night, and we can flip a coin for who gets to take you home. Or we can both take you home for a kiss or two, Chet chimed in. That's a much better offer than being with a guy who's in a hospital. Tim raised his hand behind Jeannie, making a rude gesture, and said, You know they're both smooth talkers and trouble, right? You can't trust either one of them alone with you. Ignoring Tim, Jeannie said, You boys have great offers, but I need to rest. Tim will probably sleep soon, and then I can rest too. They laughed and shook their heads as they got up and headed for the door. Chet stopped and said, Don't let him fool you. His reasons are not better than ours. He's been taking an interest in you at school for 2 years, even when you were just wearing sweats or work clothes. You can guess what he might want with your pretty blue dress. Tim showed his frustration by flipping them off, and everyone laughed. The therapy sessions with Pete were getting tougher each day, and this morning's was the hardest yet. Still, Tim was making progress, which made the therapist smile. He praised Tim and said he might recommend his release, but reminded him he needed to promise to attend all his scheduled therapy sessions. Tim promised with a big grin and walked back to his room, using his walker in front of him. This got a disapproving look from the head nurse, but a smile from a young aide who had been helping him. He waved one hand, leaned on the walker with the other, winked, and said, I appreciate all the care and attention, but I'm ready to leave this place. I'll always remember you all. He walked down the main hall and turned towards his room. The deputy sheriff, who was his guard, nodded at him as he walked by. He noticed another officer in a different uniform at the end of the hall. When he got close to his room, he saw his father-in-law standing in the doorway. He surprised him by giving him a pat on the back and stepping past him into the room. His 2 young sons jumped off the bed and ran towards him, with their mother and grandmother shouting for them to be careful and not hurt Daddy. Tim reached out to grab the older boy for a hug and a kiss, while the little brother hugged his leg. Tears welled up in Tim's eyes, but he blinked them away and happily greeted his beloved sons. After setting Patrick down, he lifted baby Mark for a hug and kiss. Mark wrapped his arms around Tim tightly, put his head on his shoulder, and said, I missed you, Daddy. Can you come home now? Patrick echoed, Yeah. Can you come home and play with us now, Daddy? We'll see, boys, Tim replied. The doctor is supposed to come by this afternoon to let me know when I can leave. Are you going to stay and have lunch with me? He added. Maybe the doctor will come after we eat. The boys turned to their mother and asked together, Are we eating with Daddy? Tim's gaze shifted to Karen, who stood across the room by his bed. He caught his breath seeing her, the woman he loved and trusted. Tears were running down her cheeks, but they did nothing to take away from her beauty. Her honey-colored hair framed her face, and she wore a lovely green dress that matched her eyes. She looked just as beautiful and innocent as on the day they met. Suddenly, painful memories hit Tim hard, and he winced. Karen had glowed with happiness at his expression of love, but now her face showed despair as she noticed the hurt in his eyes. Tim, I'm so sorry, she whispered. Tim, trying to keep things light, replied, Hi, Karen, how are you? Thanks for bringing my boys to see me. I know you've been busy, and I'm grateful to you and your parents for coming all the way to the hospital. Hello, Granny. Good to see you too. I hope you're well. Patrick tugged at Tim's pants and yelled, "Daddy, Daddy! Our policeman came with us. He keeps the bad guys away from our house and goes with us wherever we go." Tim looked at his father-in-law and asked, "No trouble driving here?" His father-in-law replied, "None at all. It's great to see you up and moving around. Are your wounds healing quickly?" Tim said that all three were healing well and that his therapy was going great. He expected to be released soon. Before his father-in-law could respond, Karen jumped in. "Then can you ride back with us today? Mom and I can take care of you, and the boys will be so happy to have you with us." Both sons cheered for the idea, but Tim simply said, "That sounds good, Karen. Let's discuss it a bit later." A medical assistant poked her head into the room and asked if Tim wanted his meal in his room or at the cafeteria with his family. The boys shouted loudly that they wanted to eat with him, so he nodded and thanked her. "Boys, why don't you and your grandparents go to the cafeteria and find us a nice table? Mommy and I will be there in a few minutes, okay?" The boys grabbed their grandparents' hands and pulled them down the hall. Tim then turned to Karen and said, "I'm going to have to pass on coming home with you, but not for the reason you might think. I have a pet nearby, and while I'm being hunted, I don't want to put you and the boys in danger. The people after me could do anything harmful, including shooting at the house or causing it to explode. Do you understand? I don't want to make you all more dangerous just by living together right now. We will talk about what happened soon, but for now, I need to focus on healing, and we all need to stay safe." They needed to break the news to the boys gently before returning to her parents' house. "But for now, let's enjoy lunch and let them play a bit. I still need to exercise and walk around." Karen's face showed her feelings as he spoke. She looked fearful while he told her this, sad when he said he wouldn't come home, but also a mix of hope and fear when he explained why. Ultimately, she felt pure hope when he said they would talk soon. She knew she had no excuses, but at least he was willing to listen to her now, or soon. That hope was more than she had dared to wish for. She at least could say she was sorry. Lunch had been nice and cheerful, even with the police officers watching them from their table. After some time walking around in the pleasant spring air, they all sat down at a big picnic table. The boys shared with their dad everything they had been up to. His mother-in-law told some funny stories about them, and Gramps asked if he would go back to work when he felt better. He said he didn't know. It all depended on whether the bad guys had been caught. Gramps then asked if he could manage the house payments if Karen didn't go back to work. He said he could. After about an hour and a half, the deputy asked them to start heading back before the traffic got busy, and they reluctantly agreed. Tim could see that everyone, including his in-laws, wanted to go back to a time when Karen hadn't done what she did, when they were a big, happy family, and he was their favorite son-in-law. He wished them well, shook hands with Gramps, kissed Granny and Karen on the cheek, and hugged and kissed his boys. The deputy in charge of their safety led them away. Tim turned around to see the other deputy watching him. When he walked back inside, he saw the deputy on the phone, and the man looked worried. Tim felt uneasy about that call, even if it was hard to tell why. He was tired now, and the walker was helping him as he moved down the long hallway toward his room. When he reached the nurse's station, one of them called out to him and pointed to the conference room to his right. He went in to find his doctor waiting with his file and some papers. Dr. Collins cheerfully announced that Tim could go home today at 6 o'clock, as long as he followed the doctor's advice and did what he was supposed to do. He quickly agreed and signed the papers. While he was sitting there, he noticed that his security detail had disappeared again. They came back just a few minutes later. Was that a bathroom break or something worse? Tim wasn't sure, but he asked to stay and use the phone. When the doctor left, he called the Texas Ranger who was working on his case and quietly shared his worries with his back turned to the door. Ranger Boyd listened and then said, "Well, that explains a lot, doesn't it? They seem to always be one step ahead of us during this chase. We were starting to think we had a leak. Let me check on that and I'll get back to you. Can you talk on the phone in your room?" Tim replied that he was concerned about that, but asked him to call, let it ring twice, and then hang up. Tim would leave the room and call back from the conference room. Just as they were about to hang up, Ranger Boyd excitedly said to hold on a moment. He had something important to check and wanted to talk to Tim after that. Tim's heart started racing, but it went into overdrive when Boyd told him that someone had tried to force the deputy guarding his family off the road. but the deputy had managed to escape. Police from the area were looking for the car used by the attackers, which had stolen license plates. Boyd told Tim, "I think this proves our worries are real. Stay safe. I'm 10 minutes away." Tim was furious, and it sharpened his senses. He took a deep breath and called the deputy into the conference room. "I have some good news for you, Deputy Jackson," Tim said, sounding cheerful and holding the door open with his bad arm. "I'm sure your family will be happy to know you won't have to keep watching over me." When the deputy walked past him, Tim let the door go and grabbed the gun from the holster on Jackson's hip. "But the next few minutes will decide if you ever see your family again," Tim warned, anger in his voice. He cocked the gun and pointed it at the deputy's neck. Jackson stepped back with fear and raised his hands, looking confused. "We're going to play 20 questions while we wait for Ranger Boyd," Tim said. "When he gets here, either you will be sitting at that desk ready to explain what has been going on, or he will find you on the floor after I take your gun and defend myself. So, Deputy Jackson, will you answer my questions honestly and completely, or did you say goodbye to your family for the last time?" Jackson looked sick and afraid, and he was now thinking about how he might grab the gun back. "No, you can't," Tim said calmly, seeing the fear in Jackson's eyes. "You're too late. Even if you try, I will shoot first. Trust me. I've already taken the slack out of the trigger, so even a little movement from me leads to your death." Jackson's shoulders drooped as he accepted what was happening. Tim said, "Sit down and keep your hands on the desk, palms down, and let's begin." Jackson complied. Tim added, "Answer honestly and completely, or else. Who are you reporting to?" "The sheriff," Jackson said, sounding empty. "What did he tell you to do?" Tim asked. "To watch you and your visitors while I'm here. I can also change out the tapes in your room before I leave. I take those to him each night." Tim was only a little surprised that he was being recorded. He wondered where those hidden cameras were and if the phone was also tapped. He turned back to Jackson and coldly asked, "How did they know?" "When my wife and kids were leaving, I wondered about their journey home. Today, I was told to call him if they arrived. I needed to find out their plans and report back. I chatted with another officer about how he would watch over my family and keep them safe on the way home. He explained the route he selected, keeping them off the main road until they passed through a town. I called the sheriff and shared what I had learned." "You know someone will try to harm them now that you've shared this information?" Tim said in a cold voice. "The sheriff needed to know so he could get more help. He called me again a few minutes before you called me in here. He informed me that someone tried to run my family off the road and shot at them. The deputy and my family got away, so everyone was safe. The sheriff acted like I had done a great thing by telling him so he could help them. But seeing you with your sweet family and knowing they were attacked right after I told him their route made me doubt his whole story about you. He said he heard you would be released today, so I should take you into the next county where the other sheriff was waiting. Honestly, Coach, I had no idea what was going on. He told me you were the bad guy, that other officers were wrong about you. He said you had hit your wife and threatened people who tried to help, and they shot you to defend themselves. Knowing what I know about you, your family, and your friends, that doesn't make sense. I know you might not believe me now, but I plan to talk to the task force leader from Cedar Park tonight. I wanted to hear his side and then tell him I'd been watching you for the sheriff." Tim heard Ranger Boyd asking the nurses where he was. He quickly gave the gun back to Officer Jackson, told him to put it away, and took a seat. Jackson looked surprised until Tim greeted the ranger with, "Jim." "Officer Jackson has something he wants to tell you," Tim said. "He's already told me, and we can trust his words." Tim listened while Elias explained what Sheriff Collins told him, where the recording devices were hidden, and why Collins needed to record Tim's actions. Boyd asked Jackson why he was on this job. Jackson shrugged and said he didn't know, but it was the best job he had since starting over a year ago. He had been on night patrol for the past 9 months, even though he lived far from Cedar Park near Jonestown. Boyd asked if Jackson ever had doubts about the sheriff. He shook his head and said, "Yeah, he seems shady. My dad and grandfather were both sheriffs in West Texas, so I grew up around police work. My dad warned me about his reputation when I applied, but my wife is from Lake Travis, and all her family is near Jonestown, so I took the job." 2 months later at the Christmas party, the old sheriff hit on Jennifer right in front of his wife and everyone else. In January, I got a new night shift near Taylor. My wife was angry because I was gone 4 nights a week, but I promised it would be only for 6 months while I settled in. Now, she always seems mad at me, and our marriage is on shaky ground. I blame that guy. Now that I know he's crooked, I'll do anything to help bring him down. I'm convinced he used what I told him to set up the attack on Coach Kelly's family. Tim was paying attention, but part of his mind was on a film he had but hadn't watched yet. It was called Jennifer J. When the ranger started to speak to him again, Tim interrupted. "Officer Jackson, do you know any of the men who tried to hurt me?" He named each one, and Jackson said no until he got to Barry Benton. His face turned red and he said, "Yeah, I know that creep. He's one of the sheriff's friends. And he hits on my wife right in front of me too. Sure, my wife is lovely, but his wife is stunning. Why would he go after my Jennifer?" Tim and the ranger looked at each other and Tim raised his eyebrows in question. "It's not my first choice, but..." Boyd nodded and they turned back to Jackson. "There's a chance we can answer your questions, but you'll need to follow me to another place after I'm released. I have something for you to see, then we can talk more." Boyd told him he should call his wife or her family now that they were home. Karen answered, asking if they were all okay. "Are you guys all right?" Tim asked. Karen began crying and said, "No, we're not okay. None of us are hurt, but we're scared again. Tim, the driver was JW, and the man who shot at us is that horrible guy, Larry. You need to come here and stay with us for protection." "Maybe I will, Karen, but right now I have a vital question for you," Tim said. "We have a clue that might help finish this fast. What you tell us is important, so think carefully before you respond. Did the Williamson County Sheriff ever join you at your gatherings at the lake?" Karen hesitated for a moment and finally said, "I hate to admit it because it shows my mistakes, but yes, he did, twice. He brought a young girl with him named Jennifer Johnson or something close. She seemed scared too and said her husband was a deputy. She said he told her if she didn't do what he wanted, her husband and family would be in danger. I refused to do what they wanted with her, hoping it would help us both escape the trouble we were in. The sheriff warned me that my kids and husband might go missing too if we didn't follow his orders. She said we had to go along with it because the sheriff was a powerful and dangerous man." Tim asked, "So what did they ask you to do, and did you do it?" Karen stayed quiet for a moment before she spoke. "There was a scene with girls, then a scene with the sheriff and Benton. They filmed both. After that, the sheriff forced the girl to do something with JW and Steve. Then he took her away, and JW and Steve brought me home." Tim covered the phone and told Ranger Boyd, "That's probably the tape called JJ plus KKK. With a sigh, Tim asked, "Are there more details? You need to tell us everything, Karen. Your life, my life, and the lives of our kids and your parents might depend on it. Stop giving us bits and pieces. I'm putting Ranger Boyd on the line so you won't have to tell me, but please, tell him everything." Tim passed the phone to Boyd and moved over to the other side of the desk near the deputy. He asked, "What's your first name? I don't think we've met, or maybe I wasn't quite myself." The deputy shook his hand and replied, Randy Jackson." Tim continued, "So my wife Jennifer is the one you were talking about with your wife? She's also caught up in this situation." Randy replied, "I'm not completely sure, but I can show you the start of a video and we can see. Are you interested?" Tim nodded. Randy closed his eyes and said quietly, "Not really, but I have to fix things in my marriage. I guess we need to check her choices and what pushed her to make them." He explained that the sheriff had threatened both him and his daughter if Karen didn't listen to him. Randy said what they were doing was making films for adults. Actually, he corrected himself, they were tricking, blackmailing, and forcing women to perform on camera. "They really thought they were stars," he said with anger. The sheriff was involved, along with Karen and a man named Barry Benton. "I got hold of some films from a source I can't name, and I have them now. If you want, I can show you one with Jennifer J on it, and another called JJ plus KK. Let's hope neither of them has your wife." Boyd had just finished his call with Karen and listened closely. He described the woman in the movies as a slim, 5'9" brunette with long hair and striking blue eyes. He paused when he saw the look on Randy's face and said, "Well, we need a plan to stop that sheriff and put him behind bars with bad company." Tim asked, "How can we do this?" The sadness on Randy's face turned to anger. He looked at Boyd and Kelly and said, "I might have an idea, but it could put us in danger. It involves trusting Ranger Boyd and anyone he can count on." Randy explained the plan about taking someone home in his Ford. He was told to inform a deputy ahead of time so they could ensure a safe trip on the back roads. He felt sure something bad might happen on that journey. Randy asked, "What can we do to stay safe?" Boyd told them to decide what weapons they might need. He then called his captain. About 10 minutes later, he asked what they needed and informed them that help would arrive soon. Tim leaned forward, looked straight at Randy and said, "Are you sure you want to do this? They want me, not you. I can drive myself home. You, the Rangers, and anyone else can support me. You shouldn't have to risk yourself." Randy replied, "I think the sheriff wants both of us out of the way, but we have a better chance together. 2 sets of eyes, 2 plans for defense." Tim smirked, raised his eyebrow, and nodded. Ranger Boyd agreed, and soon they were preparing their plan. They got permission to monitor the sheriff's phone and set a trap. The call time was set for 5 p.m., giving the Rangers time to prepare. That also let the sheriff plan his attack, which was part of the trap. Getting permission to tap the sheriff's phone took some effort, but it was crucial. Randy was right. The sheriff wanted him and Tim dead because they intended to use both Jennifer and Karen in more films for powerful people. The Rangers debated whether they should arrest the sheriff right away or set a trap to catch the other criminals in the act. Tim worried that the men still free would escape capture if they didn't go through with the plan. His idea won the day, and they left the parking lot ready and alert at exactly 4 p.m. Before they left, the ranger named him a deputy to help protect themselves on this trip. They thought the attack would happen on the twisted and quiet back road they took, but just as they got close to Cedar Park, a helicopter told them that a big pickup truck on a side road had started moving as soon as their car came into view. The truck was hiding behind some bushes near the highway. They could either shoot from their hiding spot or try to crash into the deputy's car at the intersection. The truck was on their right. Tim turned sideways in his seat to shoot the semi-automatic rifle out of the passenger window. He kept the gun inside the car, but was ready to press the barrel through the open window and shoot fast. It was hard for him to move because of his hurt left arm, but he pushed through the pain to focus on the danger. Both vehicles attacked at the same time. They zoomed out from hiding in a big truck with strong bumpers in the back. The passenger in the enemy truck shot at Tim and Randy as soon as they broke from behind the bushes. Randy slammed on the brakes and turned left to give Tim the best shot. He fired at the truck, trying to hit the driver. The truck swerved to the right and went right in front of them, landing in the ditch beside the road. The driver still controlled the truck enough to turn left and drive down the ditch away from them. Tim aimed his rifle at the truck and saw that JW was driving and Sauer was next to him. The gunman pulled his weapon inside and ducked down as bullets hit the truck, but not before Tim and Randy saw that it was Barnes. The truck sped off and turned to the right. A short distance down the road, Randy backed up to the intersection and turned around, speeding off after the men who had attacked them. The helicopter warned them that backup was 5 minutes away and told them to wait before getting involved. But within a minute, the helicopter said the truck was parked at a shopping center near Highway 620, and then they heard, "Oh no, they can see us and are shooting." Breaking away, Randy drove to the back of the shopping center. They got out, each carrying a shotgun and a semi-automatic rifle, and quietly moved around the side. They saw the truck in the middle of the parking lot, but no one was inside. Just then, a car with 2 state troopers came into the lot and blocked the exit, taking position behind their cruiser. Another ranger arrived quickly, along with a cruiser with 2 Cedar Park police officers. They pulled in behind the shopping center and joined Randy and Tim, telling them to stay where they were. The ranger and the 2 officers carefully moved through the parking lot to the truck, checked it was empty, and began to search the 30 or so other cars in the lot. Randy ran into the nearest store and asked the people inside if they saw anyone from the truck shooting at the helicopter. He found out that all 6 people in the store had seen it happen. They excitedly told him that 5 men got into 2 cars, with 2 jumping into a black pickup and the other 3 into a dark Mercedes-Benz. Randy rushed back to his cruiser and radioed the information, asking for an alert on the vehicles and warning that they should be considered armed and dangerous. Tim stood outside, shaking with anger. He couldn't hold back his tears again. Stay tuned, dear listeners. The next part is coming in just a few hours. Hey, listeners. If you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales. As I walked away from the shattered remnants of our confrontation, I knew there was no turning back. Their deceit had unleashed a wrath within me. Each step I took was a step towards retribution. The pieces were falling into place, and their downfall was inevitable. This was my vengeance.